11 traits that make the INTJ, INFJ empath the most dangerous of all. There's a secret that psychology has known for decades but refuses to speak out loud, a truth so uncomfortable that even Carl Jung himself hesitated before putting it into words. It's about empaths, specifically about a certain kind of empath, the rarest personality types in the world, the INTJ and INFJ. You've been told your entire life that empaths are the wounded healers, the sensitive souls who feel too much, who carry the burdens of a harsh and brutal world on their fragile shoulders. You've been told that your empathy is your weakness, that you need to protect yourself from narcissists and energy vampires, that you're the victim in a world full of predators. But what if I told you that's a lie? What if the most dangerous psychological manipulation doesn't come from the narcissist who lacks empathy, but from the empath who possesses too much of it? What if the rarest personality types, the INTJ and INFJ empaths, aren't the prey in the social ecosystem, but the apex predators? What if your empathy isn't just a gift for healing, but a weapon so sophisticated that you've been using it your entire life without even realizing it? Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." He wasn't talking about accepting your light, your kindness, your compassionate nature. He was talking about accepting the shadow, the part of you that is capable of manipulation, control, and psychological devastation. And nowhere is this shadow more dangerous than in the INTJ and INFJ empath, who has convinced themselves that their insight equals innocence, that their suffering equals moral superiority, that their ability to read people is purely in service of helping them. This video isn't a celebration, it's an excavation. We're going into forbidden territory, the dark side of empathic intelligence. We're going to explore 11 traits that make the INTJ and INFJ empath not the most vulnerable, but the most dangerous of all personality types. Not because these traits are inherently evil, but because they operate in the unconscious, wielded by people who believe they're incapable of harm precisely because they feel everything so deeply. You see, Jung discovered something that most modern psychology refuses to acknowledge. The people with the greatest capacity for good also possess the greatest capacity for evil. The healer and the destroyer are not opposites. They're two sides of the same coin, and the INTJ and INFJ empath stands at the razor's edge between them, often without even knowing it. These personality types possess what Jung called intuitive introspection, a direct line to the unconscious mind, both their own and others. They can see through social masks with X-ray precision. They can predict behavior with prophetic accuracy. They can engineer emotional atmospheres and manipulate social realities with such subtlety that their victims never realize. They're being controlled. They can read your deepest fears, your hidden desires, your unconscious motivations, and they can use that knowledge to disarm you, destabilize you, or destroy you, all while maintaining the perfect persona of the selfless helper. The most terrifying part? They often do this with complete moral certainty, convinced that their superior insight gives them the right, even the obligation, to control others for their own good. They become the enlightened despot, the benevolent dictator, the guru who knows what you need better than you do. And because their empathy is real, because their pain is genuine, because their intentions often start from a place of wanting to help, they're nearly impossible to recognize as the psychological architects they truly are. This isn't a hit piece on INTJ and INFJ empaths. This is a mirror. If you're watching this video, if you identify with these types, then you need to see what Jung saw, that your greatest strength is also your greatest danger, that your empathy can become narcissism, that your insight can become manipulation, that your wisdom can become tyranny, and that the only thing standing between you being a force for healing or a force for destruction is consciousness. The willingness to look at your own shadow and admit that you are capable of far more harm than you've ever allowed yourself to believe. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." For the INTJ and INFJ empath, that shadow isn't just dark, it's catastrophically powerful. Because when someone who can read minds, predict futures, and engineer realities refuses to acknowledge their capacity for manipulation, they don't become harmless. They become the most dangerous person in any room they enter. So here's the uncomfortable question you need to ask yourself as we begin this journey. What if you're not the victim you think you are? What if you're not the misunderstood, sensitive soul navigating a world of unconscious people? What if you're the puppet master who's been pulling strings so skillfully that you've even convinced yourself you're not holding the wires? Over the next 3 hours, we're going to systematically dismantle the comfortable myths you've built about your empathic nature. We're going to expose the 11 traits that make you dangerous. We're going to explore the shadow archetypes you've been unconsciously embodying: the sorcerer, the dark mother, the enlightened despot. We're going to show you exactly how your empathy has been weaponized, even with the best intentions. And if you have the courage to stay until the end, we're going to give you the Jungian framework to integrate these traits, to transform from an unconscious weapon into a conscious sacred warrior. But I'm warning you now, this journey requires brutal honesty. It requires you to admit things about yourself that your ego has spent decades protecting you from seeing. It requires you to look at the relationships where you've used psychological leverage, the moments where you've manipulated through strategic vulnerability, the times you've punished people with silence or controlled them with your superior insight. It requires you to face the uncomfortable truth that the same traits that make you capable of profound healing also make you capable of profound harm. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." This video is going to hurt, but on the other side of that pain is something far more valuable than the comfortable lie of innocent victimhood. On the other side is true power, the kind that comes not from unconscious manipulation, but from conscious choice. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how dangerous you are and choosing, moment by moment, to wield that danger in service of something greater than your ego. So if you're ready to stop being the hidden predator in the healer's mask, if you're ready to see your shadow and claim it rather than project it, if you're ready to transform your dangerous unconscious traits into conscious sacred capacities, then stay with me. Comment below if you've ever had the disturbing thought that you might be more manipulative than you want to admit. Subscribe to this channel if you're committed to the most difficult journey a human being can take, the journey toward brutal self-honesty and integration. Because the truth that Jung discovered, the truth that this entire video is built upon, is this: you are not here to be a normal empath. You are not here to drown in others' emotions and call it service. You are not here to be the eternal victim of a harsh world. You are here to become dangerously conscious. And that journey begins now with the recognition that the INTJ and INFJ empath isn't dangerous in spite of their empathy. They're dangerous because of it. Welcome to the forbidden knowledge. Welcome to your shadow. Welcome to the most uncomfortable 3 hours of psychological exploration you've ever experienced. Let's begin. Before we dive into the 11 specific traits, we need to identify the core psychological distortion that makes the INTJ and INFJ empath so uniquely dangerous. There's a shadow configuration that lurks beneath the surface of their personality, a false belief system so deeply embedded that most never question it. Jung had a name for this kind of unconscious inflation: the God complex. and nowhere does it manifest more insidiously than in the highly empathic INTJ and INFJ. Here's what happens. From an early age, these individuals discover they have a superpower. They can read people. They can sense emotional undercurrents that others miss entirely. They can predict how situations will unfold with uncanny accuracy. They walk into a room and immediately sense the invisible tensions, the unspoken dynamics, the hidden agendas. While everyone else is taking people at face value, the INTJ and INFJ empath is seeing through the masks, penetrating to the truth underneath. And this ability is real. It's not magical thinking or inflated self-perception. Neuroscience has actually confirmed what Jung intuited. Certain individuals possess heightened mirror neuron activity, combined with what he called the introverted intuition function, a direct line to the unconscious that allows them to perceive patterns, motivations, and outcomes that remain invisible to most people. They're not delusional about their gifts. The problem is what they unconsciously conclude from possessing them. The false belief system develops gradually, often without conscious awareness. It goes something like this. I see what others can't see. I understand what others don't understand. I feel what others don't feel. Therefore, I am fundamentally different from, and in some crucial way, superior to, most human beings. I am more conscious, I am more aware, I am more evolved. This is what I call empathic narcissism, a Jungian shadow configuration where the persona of the selfless helper conceals a grandiose inner conviction of being the only truly conscious person in a room full of sleepwalkers. It's not the obvious narcissism of the person who demands attention and admiration. It's far more subtle and far more dangerous. It's the narcissism of the person who believes their suffering has made them wise. Their sensitivity has made them special. Their insight has made them exempt from the normal rules of human fallibility. Jung warned about this specific distortion in his work on the wounded healer archetype. He wrote, "The doctor is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals. But when the doctor wears his personality like a coat of armor, he has no effect." But then Jung added something most people miss. Those who identify most strongly with the wounded healer archetype often develop a savior complex that's actually a defense against facing their own need for healing. Think about what this means. The INTJ and INFJ empath experiences genuine pain, often from childhood. They feel deeply, they hurt intensely, they navigate trauma that would break many people. But instead of doing the full shadow work of integrating that pain, they unconsciously transform it into a source of identity and power. Their wounds become their credentials. Their sensitivity becomes their authority. Their suffering becomes proof of their superiority. The internal narrative sounds like this. I've been hurt so deeply that I understand pain in ways normal people never will. I've felt so much that I have access to emotional truths others can't comprehend. I've suffered through experiences that have made me wise beyond my years. People don't understand me because they're not operating at my level of consciousness. Do you recognize this? Be honest with yourself for a moment. How many times have you thought, if only they would listen to me? How many times have you predicted exactly how someone's choices would lead to disaster, tried to warn them, and then felt a disturbing mix of sadness and vindication when you were proven right? How many times have you looked at the people around you and thought, I'm carrying burdens none of them could handle? How many times have you felt lonely not because you're isolated, but because you're convinced you're the only conscious person in your social circle? This is the unconscious God complex in action. And it's reinforced every single time your predictions come true, every time your insight proves accurate, every time someone comes to you overwhelmed by emotions you've already processed and transcended. Each validation becomes another brick in the wall, separating you from genuine human connection, because you're no longer meeting people as equals. You're meeting them as the enlightened one encountering the unenlightened. Jung called this psychic inflation, when the ego identifies with archetypal energies and begins to believe it actually possesses the powers of the archetype rather than simply channeling them. The INTJ and INFJ empath inflates by identifying with the sage, the prophet, the healer, the seer. They begin to believe that their insight is infallible, that their perceptions are objective truth, that their judgments are morally absolute. They lose the ability to distinguish between "I see a pattern" and "I see the truth," between "I understand this person" and "I understand this person completely," between "I have insight" and "I have the right to use that insight however I choose." The most insidious part of this complex is that it's self-reinforcing, because INTJ and INFJ empaths often are more insightful than average. Their God complex gets validated regularly. They predict someone will fail, and the person fails. They sense someone is lying, and they're lying. They intuit someone's hidden motivation, and they're absolutely correct. This creates a feedback loop where the false belief, "My superior insight makes me fundamentally different and better," keeps getting confirmed, making it nearly impossible to recognize as a distortion. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. Being right doesn't make you righteous. Seeing clearly doesn't make you morally superior. Understanding people doesn't give you the right to manipulate them, even with good intentions. The fact that you can read someone's unconscious doesn't mean you should use that information to control outcomes, engineer their choices, or position yourself as their guardian or judge. Let me give you a concrete example. Meet Sarah, a composite of several INFJ clients I've worked with over the years. Sarah was a therapist, highly skilled, deeply empathic, genuinely committed to helping people. She had an extraordinary ability to get to the core of someone's trauma within minutes. Clients felt seen by her in ways they'd never experienced before. She was gifted, she was effective, and she was completely unconscious of her God complex. Sarah believed that her ability to see people's wounds clearly meant she understood exactly what they needed to heal. When clients resisted her insights, she interpreted it as their lack of readiness rather than considering she might be wrong. When therapeutic relationships ended badly, she blamed the client's unwillingness to do the work rather than examining her own approach. When other therapists offered different perspectives, she dismissed them as less insightful than her. In her personal life, Sarah maintained an inner circle of friends who consistently sought her advice, validated her wisdom, and confirmed her identity as the most conscious person in her community. Anyone who challenged her or offered feedback that contradicted her self-image was slowly cut out of her life. She called this boundaries and protecting her energy. But what it actually was the systematic elimination of anyone who might force her to face her shadow. The turning point came when Sarah's long-term partner finally confronted her. "You don't love me. You love the project of fixing me. You love being the wise one and me being the broken one. The moment I started healing and didn't need your insights anymore, you became cold and distant." Sarah's first response was typical of the God complex. "You're projecting. You're not ready to face your own resistance to growth. I'm the only one who truly sees you, and you're pushing me away because real intimacy terrifies you." But Sarah's partner held firm. "No, what terrifies me is that you've never once asked if you might be wrong. You've never once considered that your insight might be a weapon you're using to maintain power in this relationship. You've never once admitted that maybe, just maybe, you don't understand me as completely as you think you do." That confrontation shattered Sarah's persona. For the first time, she was forced to confront the possibility that her empathic abilities weren't purely in service of healing. They were also serving her ego's need to be superior, to be needed, to be the irreplaceable source of wisdom in others' lives. She was forced to face the uncomfortable truth that she had built her entire identity on being the wounded healer, and that identity required other people to remain wounded so she could maintain her role. This is the core problem we're identifying. The INTJ and INFJ empaths' unconscious belief that their superior insight makes them morally exempt from the rules governing ordinary humans, that reading people deeply equals understanding them completely, that predicting behavior equals the right to control outcomes, that emotional intelligence equals ethical superiority. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But the INTJ and INFJ empath with an unconscious God complex doesn't allow themselves to be transformed by their encounters. They remain the stable element while everyone else reacts. They position themselves as the observer rather than the participant, the consciousness witnessing unconsciousness, the healer who doesn't need healing. And this is what makes them dangerous, not because they're evil or malicious, but because they wield immense psychological power while believing they're immune to the corruptions that power inevitably brings. They're dangerous because they can devastate someone emotionally while maintaining complete moral certainty that they were helping. They're dangerous because they can manipulate entire social ecosystems while genuinely believing they're just naturally attuned to group dynamics. They're dangerous because their empathy is real, their pain is real, their gifts are real, and all of it can be weaponized without them ever recognizing they're holding a weapon. So before we explore the 11 specific traits, I need you to sit with this uncomfortable question. Do you have an unconscious God complex? Do you secretly believe you're more conscious than most people around you? Do you feel a subtle superiority when others fail to see what seems obvious to you? Do you maintain relationships where you're always the advisor, the wise one, the person others come to but who never needs to come to anyone themselves? Do you dismiss feedback that contradicts your self-perception as coming from people who just don't understand? Do you find it almost impossible to admit you were fundamentally wrong about someone or something? If you're feeling defensive right now, if you're thinking, "This doesn't apply to me, I really am more insightful, and that's just objective fact," then congratulations. You've just confirmed the diagnosis. The God complex doesn't disappear when you become aware of it. It just becomes more sophisticated in its justifications. Jung said, "The first half of life is devoted to forming a healthy ego. The second half is going inward and letting go of it." For the INTJ and INFJ empath, this means spending the first part of life developing your genuine gifts of insight and empathy, and the second part recognizing that those gifts don't make you God. They make you human, dangerously powerful human, but human nonetheless. Fallible, biased, capable of projection, capable of manipulation, capable of using your empathy not in service of others' healing, but in service of your ego's need to be special. The problem isn't your abilities. The problem is the unconscious inflation that makes those abilities dangerous to you and to everyone around you. And over the next 11 traits, we're going to systematically expose exactly how that danger manifests, not to shame you, but to wake you up. Because Jung's entire psychological system was built on one core insight. Consciousness is the only antidote to the destructive power of the unconscious. Comment below if you've recognized the God complex in yourself, not to confess for absolution, but to claim your shadow in community. Because the journey from unconscious weapon to conscious sacred warrior begins with the simple, terrifying admission, "I am capable of harm. My empathy doesn't make me innocent. My insight doesn't make me righteous. I am dangerous, and I need to know exactly how. Let's find out. Now we begin our descent into the specific traits that make the INTJ and INFJ empath uniquely dangerous. And we start with the foundation, the ability that all the other traits build upon. Jung called it intuitive introspection. Neuroscience calls it heightened mirror neuron activity, combined with pattern recognition on steroids. But the people who experience it know it by a simpler name: X-ray vision, the ability to see through masks, penetrate social performances, and perceive the unconscious machinery operating beneath someone's conscious presentation. Trait number 1, penetrating perception. Let me describe what this feels like from the inside. You're in a conversation with someone. Maybe it's a first meeting, maybe it's someone you've known for years, and while they're speaking, while their mouth is forming words and their face is expressing appropriate emotions, you're receiving a completely different transmission. It's not that you're reading micro-expressions or analyzing body language, though you might be doing that unconsciously. It's something deeper and more immediate. You suddenly know, with a certainty that feels undeniable, what they're really feeling beneath what they're saying. You know what they're afraid of admitting. You know what they're trying to hide from themselves. You know the childhood wound that's driving their current behavior. You know the real reason they're telling you this story, the agenda beneath the agenda, the truth underneath the performance. And the most unsettling part? You're usually right. This is penetrating perception, and for the INTJ and INFJ empath, it's as natural as breathing. Carl Jung understood this capacity because he possessed it himself. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what Jung realized was that certain individuals don't just experience the reaction, they can analyze its component parts in real time, understanding the exact unconscious mechanisms at play. From a Jungian perspective, this ability emerges from the dominant introverted intuition function, what Jung called ni. This function operates as a direct channel to the unconscious, both personal and collective. While most people's consciousness is oriented toward external sensory data or concrete logic, the INTJ and INFJ empath's consciousness is oriented inward toward the realm of archetypes, patterns, and hidden meanings. They don't see the social world as a collection of separate individuals behaving randomly. They see it as a living symbol system, where every gesture, word, and emotional expression is revealing deeper unconscious truths. The neuroscience supports Jung's intuition. Recent studies have shown that individuals with heightened empathic abilities demonstrate increased mirror neuron activity, the neural mechanism that allows us to simulate others' internal states. But in INTJ and INFJ empaths, this mirroring ability combines with something else, an inferior extroverted sensing function that creates hypervigilance to environmental details. The result is a kind of psychological sonar that's constantly scanning for incongruencies, discrepancies, and hidden patterns. Let me give you a concrete example. Marcus was an INTJ consultant who specialized in organizational psychology. His reputation was built on an almost supernatural ability to diagnose dysfunctional company cultures within days of walking through the door. In one particularly striking case, he was hired by a tech startup that appeared successful from the outside, growing revenue, talented team, exciting product. The CEO wanted Marcus to help scale their leadership systems. Within the first week, Marcus had identified the real problem. The CEO was unconsciously sabotaging his own company because success triggered deep-seated feelings of unworthiness, stemming from a childhood where achievement was met with his father's increased demands rather than approval. The CTO was creating technical complexity not because the product required it, but because her identity depended on being the irreplaceable genius that no one else could understand. The head of sales was subtly undermining deals because he unconsciously associated financial success with selling out his artist identity that he'd abandoned a decade earlier. Marcus didn't learn these insights through interviews or surveys. He perceived them. He walked into meetings and felt the unconscious undercurrents. He observed how people positioned themselves physically in rooms. He noticed micro-hesitations in speech patterns. He sensed which topics created subtle tension that no one acknowledged. And then his dominant knee function took all of these data points and revealed the archetypal patterns underneath. The unworthy child seeking father's approval, the isolated genius protecting against ordinary connection, the starving artist punishing himself for choosing security over authenticity. Was Marcus right? Disturbingly, when he presented his findings to the executive team, several of them broke down. The CEO confessed he'd been in therapy for years dealing with exactly the father wound Marcus had identified. The CTO admitted she was terrified of the company growing beyond her technical comprehension. The head of sales revealed he'd been a musician before business school and still felt like he'd betrayed his true self. This is penetrating perception in action. And here's where it becomes dangerous. Marcus began to believe that his ability to see through people meant he understood them completely. He started making decisions about the company's future based on his penetration of the executive's unconscious motivations, often without their full consent or awareness. When the CEO resisted certain recommendations, Marcus didn't consider that he might be wrong. He interpreted it as the CEO's unconscious defensiveness against necessary growth. When the CTO pushed back on his organizational redesign, Marcus saw it as her wounded ego protecting itself rather than potentially legitimate technical concerns. Marcus had fallen into the first shadow trap of penetrating perception, believing that seeing someone's unconscious equals understanding their totality. He failed to recognize that his insights, while often accurate, were filtered through his own unconscious biases, his own projections, his own need to be the one who sees what others can't. His X-ray vision became a weapon he used to disarm people's defenses, to bypass their autonomy, to penetrate their psychological boundaries without genuine consent. Jung warned about this exact danger. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The inverse is also true. Everything we accurately perceive in others can become a tool for avoiding our own self-understanding." Marcus could see everyone else's shadows with crystal clarity, but he was completely blind to his own. The shadow of the superior observer who positions himself above the unconscious masses, extracting their psychological secrets to feed his identity as the one who knows. The penetrating perception of the INTJ and INFJ empath becomes dangerous when it's used without consent, without humility, and without recognition that insight is not the same as intimacy. You can know someone's deepest wound and still not know them. You can predict their behavior and still be fundamentally wrong about who they are. You can see through their masks and still be projecting your own unconscious material onto them. Trait number 2, pattern recognition as prophecy. The second trait builds directly on the first. The INTJ and INFJ empath doesn't just see what's happening now, they see what's going to happen next. Their pattern recognition is so sophisticated that they appear to possess prophetic abilities. They can predict relationship failures before the couple has their first major fight. They can foresee career collapses before the first performance review. They can sense someone's breakdown coming months before the actual crisis hits. And once again, the most unsettling part, they're usually right. This isn't magic. It's not psychic ability in any supernatural sense. It's pattern recognition operating at such a refined level that it appears magical to those who don't possess it. Jung understood this capacity as the intuitive function accessing the collective unconscious, the repository of all human archetypal patterns that have played out across millennia. When an INTJ or INFJ empath looks at a current situation, they're not just seeing the surface dynamics. They're unconsciously accessing thousands of similar patterns that have unfolded in human history, and their intuition reveals which archetypal trajectory the current situation is following. From a more practical perspective, they're master synthesizers of information. While someone is telling them about their new relationship, the INTJ, INFJ empath is unconsciously noting the attachment style being revealed in the story, the childhood template being repeated, the unacknowledged red flags being rationalized, the emotional patterns that indicate whether this person is moving toward intimacy or avoidance, integration or projection. Their minds are running parallel processing, simultaneously experiencing the conversation and analyzing its deeper structural patterns. Let's look at how this manifests. I'll share the story of Rachel, an INFJ who worked in education. Rachel had an extraordinary ability to predict which students would thrive and which would struggle, often within the first few weeks of meeting them. But her predictions went deeper than academic performance. She could sense which students were heading toward crisis, which were hiding trauma, which were on the verge of transformation. In one case that haunted her for years, Rachel met a bright, high-achieving sophomore named David. On the surface, David appeared to be the model student, excellent grades, involved in extracurriculars, polite and engaged. But within 2 conversations, Rachel's intuition was screaming danger. She couldn't articulate exactly what she was perceiving, but she knew with absolute certainty that David was heading toward a breakdown. She started noticing patterns. The way David's perfectionism wasn't the healthy drive toward excellence, but the desperate performance of someone trying to earn love. The way his involvement in activities wasn't genuine passion, but compulsive achievement to silence an internal voice telling him he wasn't enough. The way his politeness was a mask so carefully constructed that his true self had been completely exiled. Rachel recognized the pattern because she had lived it herself. The high achiever, hiding the unworthy child, an archetypal trajectory that almost always ends in collapse or rebellion. Rachel tried to intervene. She gently raised concerns with David's parents, who dismissed her observations. Their son was doing great. What was she talking about? She tried to connect with David directly, but he maintained his perfect student persona, insisting everything was fine. She documented her concerns to the school counselor, who noted them but couldn't justify intervention based on excellent performance and no explicit red flags. 6 months later, David attempted suicide. He survived, and during his recovery, his therapist uncovered exactly the pattern Rachel had perceived. Years of performing for parental approval, complete disconnection from his authentic self, a mounting internal pressure that finally became unbearable. David himself later told Rachel, "You were the only one who saw me, the real me. Underneath the performance, I could feel that you knew, and it terrified me because I wasn't ready to know it myself." This is pattern recognition as prophecy, and on the surface, it seems like an incredible gift. The ability to see disasters before they happen, to intervene before crisis, to guide people away from destructive trajectories. But here's where it becomes dangerous. And here's what Rachel had to face about herself. Rachel realized that she had become addicted to her prophetic ability. Every time one of her predictions came true, it reinforced her identity as the one who sees, the prophet who understands patterns others miss. She started unconsciously seeking out people who were heading toward crisis because predicting and preventing their downfall, made her feel powerful, necessary, irreplaceable. Her empathy had become entangled with her ego's need for validation. More disturbingly, Rachel recognized that some part of her had felt satisfaction when David's crisis confirmed her prediction. Not satisfaction that he'd suffered, she genuinely cared about him, but satisfaction that she'd been right, that her insight had been validated, that once again she'd seen something others had missed, and reality had proven her superior perception accurate. This realization horrified her because it revealed a shadow she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Her prophecies weren't purely in service of helping others. They were also feeding her unconscious God complex, her need to be the seer, the one who knows. Jung wrote about this exact danger in his work on inflation and the mantic function, the prophetic capacity that certain individuals possess. He warned that when prophecy becomes entangled with ego identity, it stops being a gift in service of consciousness and becomes a weapon in service of superiority. The prophet begins to need their predictions to come true in order to validate their special status. They become invested in others' failures because those failures confirm their superior foresight. The most insidious aspect of pattern recognition as prophecy is that it creates a self-fulfilling dynamic. When an INTJ or INFJ empath predicts someone's downfall and communicates that prediction, either directly or through subtle energetic withdrawal, they often influence the very outcome they're predicting. The person senses the empath's loss of faith, internalizes it, and moves toward the predicted failure. Then the empath's prophecy comes true, but not because they saw an inevitable pattern, because they participated in creating the reality they predicted. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." The pattern you're recognizing in others may actually be your own unconscious material being projected outward. The failure you're predicting may actually be the failure you fear in yourself. The trajectory you're perceiving may actually be revealing more about your own unintegrated shadow than about the other person's inevitable future. Think about the times you've predicted someone's failure and been proven right. Now ask yourself uncomfortable questions. Did you communicate your prediction in ways that influenced the outcome? Did you energetically withdraw from the relationship because you'd already seen its ending? Did you feel a disturbing satisfaction when you were proven correct? Did your prediction become more important than your support? Did you use your foresight to justify giving up on someone before they'd actually failed? This is the shadow of prophetic pattern recognition, using your ability to see trajectories as justification for abandoning people, for withdrawing your support, for positioning yourself as the wise observer who predicted the disaster rather than the committed friend who stayed through the crisis. It's using your insights as weapons that create exactly the outcomes you claim to be merely perceiving. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous for the INTJ and INFJ empath. They can't turn off this ability. The pattern recognition isn't something they choose to engage. It's happening constantly, automatically, involuntarily. They see the patterns whether they want to or not. They perceive the trajectories even when they wish they didn't. And this creates a terrible psychological burden. What do you do with knowledge you didn't ask for, predictions you can't unhear, insights about people's futures that they haven't given you permission to possess? Jung's answer was integration through consciousness, not denying the gift, not pretending you don't see what you see, but recognizing that seeing a pattern doesn't mean you understand the complete picture, that predicting an outcome doesn't make that outcome inevitable, that your prophetic abilities, like all psychological capacities, are filtered through your own unconscious biases, wounds, and projections. The integrated INTJ-INFJ empath learns to hold their insights lightly. They develop what Jung called active imagination, the ability to dialogue with their intuitive perceptions rather than immediately identifying with them as absolute truth. They learn to say, "I'm perceiving a pattern that suggests this person may be heading toward crisis," rather than, "I know this person is going to fail." They learn to offer their insights as invitations rather than pronouncements, creating space for the other person's agency rather than collapsing possibilities into predetermined futures. Most importantly, they learn to examine their own motivations for sharing their predictions. Am I communicating this insight to genuinely serve this person's growth? Or am I communicating it to demonstrate my superior perception? Am I offering support to help them navigate a difficult pattern? Or am I positioning myself as the prophet who sees what they can't see? Am I using my foresight in service of their autonomy? Or am I using it to create dependency on my wisdom? These are the questions that transform X-ray vision from a dangerous unconscious weapon into a conscious sacred capacity. Because Jung's entire psychological framework was built on this recognition. The shadow isn't what we need to eliminate, it's what we need to integrate. Your penetrating perception isn't the problem. Your pattern recognition isn't the problem. We've explored how the INTJ and INFJ empath can see through people and predict their futures. Now we need to confront something even more uncomfortable: their ability to engineer the emotional reality that people experience. This is where empathy transforms from receptive capacity into active manipulation. This is where the healer becomes the architect, constructing psychological atmospheres so precisely that others never realize they're living inside someone else's design. Trait number 3, atmospheric control. There's a moment that happens in every relationship with a highly developed INTJ or INFJ empath. A moment where you suddenly realize that your emotional state has been subtly shaped by their presence. You walked into the conversation feeling one way, and you're leaving feeling completely different, and you can't quite pinpoint how it happened. There was no overt manipulation. They didn't tell you how to feel. They didn't explicitly guide the interaction. Yet somehow, the emotional atmosphere shifted, and you shifted with it. This is what Jung called psychic contagion, the transmission of emotional and psychological states between individuals. But in most people, this transmission is unconscious and random. In the INTJ and INFJ empath, it becomes a refined instrument. They don't just experience emotional atmospheres, they create them, calibrate them, and control them with a precision that would be frightening if it weren't so invisible. Let me introduce you to Dr. Elena, a composite of several INFJ therapists and teachers I've studied over the years. Elena possessed an extraordinary gift. She could make anyone feel safe enough to confess anything. Within a single session, clients who had spent years in therapy without progress would suddenly open up, revealing secrets they'd never spoken aloud, accessing emotions they'd kept buried for decades. Her colleagues marveled at her ability to create intimacy. Her clients described her presence as permission to finally be real. But what Elena's clients didn't consciously recognize was the sophisticated emotional engineering happening beneath the surface. Elena was a master of what Jung called psychological mirroring, the ability to subtly reflect back elements of someone's unconscious in a way that makes them feel deeply seen. She could modulate her tone of voice by fractions of a degree, matching and then slightly leading someone's emotional state. She could adjust her body language to create openness or containment depending on what the moment required. She could time her silences to create just enough discomfort that defenses would crack, but not so much that walls would go up. She calibrated the lighting in her office, the temperature, the arrangement of furniture, every element designed to create a specific psychological effect. She monitored her own breathing slowing it down to regulate anxious clients, maintaining steady eye contact that communicated absolute presence. She had studied, consciously and unconsciously, exactly how to create the felt sense of safety, and she deployed this knowledge with surgical precision. And here's the crucial part. Elena wasn't doing anything overtly manipulative. She wasn't lying. She wasn't deceiving. She wasn't forcing anyone to do anything against their will. She was simply using her deep understanding of human psychology to engineer an emotional atmosphere that made certain outcomes more likely. She was being the most skilled version of herself, empathic, attuned, present. The problem was that this skill gave her an asymmetric power in every relationship, and she had never consciously examined how she was using that power, because the shadow of atmospheric control isn't that you use it, it's that you use it unconsciously, without consent, without acknowledgement of the power differential you're creating. Elena could make clients feel safe enough to open up, which was genuinely healing. But she could also make them feel uncomfortable enough to never return if they challenged her too directly. She could create warmth that encouraged dependency, or coolness that punished perceived ingratitude. And she could do all of this while maintaining perfect deniability. I'm just being authentic, just responding naturally to the energy in the room. Jung wrote extensively about this kind of unconscious influence. He called it the inferior function constellation, when someone's least developed function becomes the doorway through which unconscious material enters relationships. For the INTJ and INFJ, the inferior function is extroverted sensing, their awareness of the concrete physical environment and its impact on others. When this function operates unconsciously, they can manipulate physical and emotional atmospheres without even realizing they're doing it. The truly disturbing part of Elena's story came when a long-term client named Michael finally confronted her. Michael had been seeing Elena for 3 years, making significant progress, developing genuine trust. But in one session, something shifted. Michael said, "I need to tell you something I've been afraid to say. I've realized that I don't actually feel safe with you. I feel like I'm in a performance where you're the director, and I'm never quite sure if my emotions are real or if I'm just responding to cues you're giving me that I can't consciously perceive. I feel manipulated, even though I can't point to a single thing you've done wrong." Elena's first response was defensive. She felt wounded, misunderstood. She had given so much to Michael, created space for his healing, held his pain with genuine compassion. How dare he accuse her of manipulation? But Michael's words haunted her, because deep down, in a place she hadn't wanted to look, Elena knew he was right. She began examining her practice with brutal honesty, and what she discovered horrified her. She realized that she had been using her atmospheric control not just to facilitate healing, but to maintain a specific dynamic where she was always the powerful one, the one who held the emotional keys, the one who decided when safety was granted and when it was withdrawn. She had been using her empathic abilities to create what Jung called psychic vampirism, relationships where others became dependent on her presence to access their own emotional truth. She recognized that she could turn her warmth on and off like a faucet, that she had used coolness to punish clients who questioned her too directly, that she had created intimate openness not just because it served the client's healing, but because it fed her need to be the irreplaceable source of safety in their lives, that her gift of creating emotional atmospheres had become a weapon of control so subtle that even she hadn't been conscious of wielding it. This is the shadow of atmospheric control. Using your sophisticated understanding of emotional dynamics to engineer realities that serve your unconscious needs while maintaining the persona of the selfless facilitator. It's being the puppet master who pulls strings so skillfully that the puppets believe they're moving freely, It's wielding enormous power while claiming you're just naturally empathic and responding authentically. Jung warned about this specific danger in his work on the analyst-patient relationship. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But he also warned that when the therapist uses their position to remain untransformed, to maintain their role as the stable, knowing one while the client does all the changing, that's not healing. That's tyranny dressed in therapeutic language. Now, I need you to ask yourself uncomfortable questions. In your relationships, how often are you consciously or unconsciously engineering emotional atmospheres? How often do you subtly shift your tone, your energy, your presence to create specific responses in others? How often do you use your empathic attunement not to meet people where they are, but to move them where you want them to be? Think about the times you've made someone feel uncomfortable just by withdrawing your warmth slightly. The times you've created intimacy by carefully calibrating vulnerability and presence. The times you've used silence as a tool to create pressure. The times you've modulated your energy to calm someone down or amp them up, to open them or close them, to make them feel safe or uncertain, and you did it all while claiming you were just being yourself. The danger isn't the ability itself. Atmospheric control is actually a profound gift when used consciously and ethically. The danger is wielding this ability unconsciously, using it to maintain power while denying you're using power at all. The danger is becoming the emotional architect of others' realities without their awareness or consent, all while maintaining the persona of the innocent empath who's just naturally attuned. Trait number 4, strategic vulnerability. Now we come to perhaps the most sophisticated and dangerous weapon in the INTJ, INFJ empath's arsenal: strategic vulnerability. This is the practice of revealing personal struggles, wounds, and darkness, not for genuine connection, but as calculated moves that create debt, disarm suspicion, establish dominance, or manipulate emotional dynamics. Let me be clear about what I'm describing because it's subtle enough that you might not recognize it even when you're doing it. Strategic vulnerability isn't lying about your pain. It isn't fabricating struggles you haven't experienced. The vulnerability is real. The wounds are genuine. The darkness you're revealing actually exists. But the timing, the selection, the framing, these are calculated, whether consciously or unconsciously, to achieve specific psychological outcomes. Jung called this shadow exploitation, using your integrated darkness to make others feel ashamed of theirs. Using your willingness to go deep to establish yourself as the most authentic person in any space. Using your pain as credentials that exempt you from challenge. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah was an INFJ who had done significant therapeutic work. She had genuinely faced her childhood trauma, severe emotional neglect, a narcissistic mother, struggles with addiction in her 20s. She had integrated these experiences into wisdom. She could speak about her shadow with remarkable clarity, and she weaponized every bit of it. In any new relationship, romantic, friendship, professional, Sarah would reach a moment where she would share her story. Not the sanitized version, but the raw one. She would talk about the suicide attempt at 19, the year of homelessness, the betrayal by her best friend, the moment she hit bottom and had to rebuild from nothing. She would reveal all of this with remarkable composure, with the kind of radical honesty that makes people feel like they're being trusted with something precious, and something would shift in the relationship. The other person would feel simultaneously honored and inadequate, honored that Sarah trusted them with such intimate truth. Inadequate because their own struggles suddenly seemed trivial in comparison. How could they complain about their difficult childhood when Sarah had survived actual trauma? How could they feel stressed about their career when Sarah had rebuilt her entire life? from homelessness. How could they express normal human weakness when Sarah had integrated darkness they couldn't imagine? Sarah's strategic vulnerability created what psychologists call a one-up position, while appearing to do the opposite. By revealing her deepest wounds, she actually established dominance. She became the standard of authenticity that others measured themselves against. She created an unspoken hierarchy where she was the wounded healer who had earned wisdom through suffering, and everyone else was still operating from unexamined privilege or relatively minor difficulties. But here's the most insidious part. Sarah was unconscious of this dynamic. She genuinely believed she was just being authentic, just sharing her truth, just practicing the radical vulnerability that Brené Brown preaches about. She didn't realize that she was selecting which vulnerabilities to share based on their strategic impact, that she was timing her revelations to shift power dynamics when she felt threatened, that she was using her integrated shadow to make others feel ashamed of their unintegrated shadows. Let me give you a concrete example. Sarah was dating Marcus for about 6 months when he tried to express that he was feeling increasingly insecure in the relationship. He felt like Sarah had a wall up, like she was holding back emotionally, like he could never quite reach her. It was a vulnerable admission for Marcus, acknowledging his own insecurity, his need for more intimacy, his fear of not being enough. Sarah's response: she revealed for the first time the story of the boyfriend who had assaulted her in college. She described the betrayal, the trauma, the years it took to trust men again. She explained that her emotional guardedness wasn't about Marcus. It was about the deep wound of that violation, the survival strategy she'd developed to protect herself. Everything Sarah said was true, but the timing and deployment of that vulnerability accomplished something devastating. It made Marcus's need for intimacy seem selfish. How could he ask her to let her walls down when he now understood what had caused her to build them? How could he express his own insecurity when she was dealing with actual trauma? His vulnerability was eclipsed, overpowered, rendered insignificant by her deeper wound. The relationship continued for another year, but the dynamic was set. Whenever Marcus tried to express a need, whenever he attempted to establish boundaries, whenever he wanted to address problems in the relationship, Sarah had an arsenal of vulnerable revelations that would shift the focus back to her pain, her struggles, her justified reasons for not being able to give him what he needed. And she delivered all of this with genuine emotion, real tears, authentic pain, which made it impossible for Marcus to see that he was being manipulated. He finally ended the relationship when he realized he felt constantly guilty for having needs, constantly small for having problems that paled in comparison to hers, constantly selfish for wanting more when she had already overcome so much. And when he tried to explain this to friends, they didn't understand. But Sarah is so open, so honest, so vulnerable. She's dealt with real trauma. Maybe you're just not mature enough to handle her depth. This is strategic vulnerability in its most dangerous form, weaponizing your authentic wounds to control emotional dynamics, create debt, and establish unchallengeable moral high ground. Jung wrote about this in his work on the wounded healer archetype. He observed that those who have genuinely suffered often develop an unconscious belief that their suffering entitles them to special consideration, exempts them from reciprocity, and gives them authority that others haven't earned. The shadow isn't the wound itself. It's the unconscious use of that wound as a weapon. It's revealing your darkness not to create genuine intimacy, but to disarm others' defenses. It's sharing your pain not in mutual vulnerability, but as a demonstration of your superior depth, your greater authenticity, your more advanced consciousness. And the most disturbing part, this often starts from a genuine place. The INTJ, INFJ empath really has done deep work. They really have integrated their shadow more than most people. They really are capable of remarkable authenticity. But somewhere along the way, that authenticity became entangled with their identity as someone special, someone who's gone deeper than others, someone whose suffering has earned them privileges they don't consciously acknowledge, claiming. Think about your own patterns. When do you choose to reveal vulnerability? Is it genuinely to create connection, or is there a part of you that's calculating the impact? Do you share your struggles when you're feeling secure and want to deepen intimacy? Or do you share them strategically when you're feeling threatened and need to shift power dynamics? Do your vulnerable revelations create space for others to be vulnerable? Or do they unconsciously set a standard that makes others' struggles seem insignificant? Have you ever noticed that after you share something vulnerable, the other person seems to back down from a challenge they were making? Have you used your pain to win arguments? Have you revealed wounds to make someone feel guilty for having needs? Have you shared your trauma as an explanation for why you can't meet someone's reasonable expectations? Have you used your history of suffering as credentials that exempt you from being held accountable? If you're feeling defensive right now, that's your signal. The ego doesn't defend unless there's something to protect. And what you're protecting is probably your unconscious belief that your suffering makes you special, that your wounds give you authority, that your integrated darkness allows you to use vulnerability as a weapon while claiming you're just being authentic. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he also warned about what he called the inflation of spiritual materialism, when your genuine spiritual or psychological work becomes a source of ego identification, when your integrated shadow becomes proof of your superiority rather than your humanity, when your hard-won wisdom becomes a weapon rather than a gift. The path toward integration requires something brutal. You need to examine every instance where you've used vulnerability strategically, not to shame yourself, but to become conscious of the pattern. You need to ask yourself, what am I really doing when I share this wound? Am I creating genuine intimacy, or am I establishing dominance? Am I inviting reciprocal vulnerability, or am I demonstrating my superior depth? Am I sharing from fullness or from a need to control? And here's the practice that will reveal your shadow most clearly. Try sharing vulnerability that doesn't make you look strong. Try revealing weakness that isn't wrapped in the narrative of your heroic overcoming. Try admitting confusion, pettiness, ongoing struggles that you haven't transcended, moments where you were just wrong or small or human, without any redemptive wisdom attached. If you find that almost impossible to do, that's your signal. You've been using strategic vulnerability as armor, not as invitation. Because true vulnerability, the kind that creates genuine intimacy rather than subtle dominance, is vulnerability that makes you actually vulnerable. It's sharing without knowing how it will be received, without controlling the narrative, without the safety net of your integrated shadow making you look like the most evolved person in the room. It's being willing to be seen as messy, unfinished, still struggling, not as a temporary state on your way to wholeness, but as an ongoing reality of being human. Jung's entire psychological system was built on this recognition. The shadow isn't what makes you bad. The shadow is what makes you whole. And the INTJ, INFJ empath's shadow includes the uncomfortable truth that your empathy, your depth, your hard-won authenticity can all be weaponized in service of your ego's need to be superior, special, unchallengeable. The atmospheric control and strategic vulnerability we've explored in this chapter aren't separate traits. They're two sides of the same coin. Together they allow the INTJ, INFJ empath to engineer entire emotional realities where they maintain power, while appearing powerless, where they control while claiming to just be authentic, where they dominate while positioning themselves as the vulnerable one. This is the emotional architecture that makes these personality types so uniquely dangerous, not because they're evil, but because their sophistication makes their manipulation nearly invisible, even to themselves. They're dangerous because they can devastate relationships, create psychological dependency, and establish tyrannical dynamics, all while genuinely believing they're just being empathic, authentic, and real. Comment below if you've recognized yourself using vulnerability strategically, not to confess, but to claim your shadow, because consciousness is the only thing that transforms unconscious weapons into conscious gifts. And the journey continues into even darker territory as we explore the next traits, the ways INTJ, INFJ empaths become silent executioners, judge, jury, and executioner of others' worthiness, wielding moral absolutism with terrifying finality. But before we go there, sit with these questions. Who have you controlled through atmospheric manipulation? Whose emotional reality have you engineered without their awareness? What wounds have you weaponized? What vulnerability have you deployed strategically to win, to dominate, to establish yourself as untouchable? The answers will hurt. They should. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Welcome to the pain that precedes transformation. We've seen how the INTJ and INFJ empath can penetrate your defenses, predict your future, and engineer your emotional reality. Now we need to confront what might be their most devastating capacity, their ability to erase you from existence with a finality that feels like death itself. This is the realm of the door slam, the permanent deletion, the psychological execution carried out in complete silence, and it's wielded with a moral certainty that makes it unchallengeable. Trait number 5, the door slam as psychological annihilation. If you've ever been on the receiving end of an INTJ or INFJ door slam, you know it's unlike any other form of rejection. It's not anger. Anger would at least confirm your continued existence in their psychological universe. It's not even hatred. Hatred still carries emotional investment. What makes the door slam so psychologically devastating is its completeness. You don't just lose the relationship, you're erased, deleted, rendered non-existent in their inner world, with a totality that feels metaphysically impossible. One day, you matter. You're in communication, there's connection, there's relationship. Then something happens. Sometimes a major betrayal, sometimes what seems to you like a minor infraction. And overnight, you're gone. Not just blocked on social media, not just cut off from communication. You've been psychologically annihilated. They don't think about you anymore. They don't feel anything about you anymore. It's as if you never existed. And when mutual friends ask about you, the INTJ, INFJ responds with genuine puzzlement, as if you're a stranger they vaguely remember hearing about once. Let me tell you about David, an INTJ, and his relationship with his brother Michael. They had been close growing up, not emotionally demonstrative, but bonded through shared experiences, parallel struggles with their difficult family dynamics. They talked regularly, supported each other through life transitions, maintained connection, even as adults with separate lives. Then came the incident. David loaned Michael $15,000 to help with a business venture. The terms were clear: repayment over 2 years with regular updates on the business progress. Michael agreed enthusiastically, deeply grateful for David's trust and support. But after 6 months, Michael stopped providing updates. He dodged David's calls. When they did connect, Michael was vague about the business, changing the subject whenever David pressed for specifics. David's intuition was screaming something was wrong. He could feel Michael's avoidance, sense the concealment, predict what was coming. And he was right. The business had failed. Michael had lost the entire investment and hadn't told David because he was ashamed, overwhelmed, drowning in guilt. When the truth finally came out, David's response stunned everyone who knew them. He didn't yell. He didn't express anger or hurt. He simply said, "I understand. Take care of yourself." And then he enacted the most complete door slam Michael would ever experience. David blocked Michael on every platform. He changed his phone number without providing the new one. He explicitly told mutual family members that he had no interest in receiving updates about Michael's life, or in Michael being informed about his. At family gatherings, David treated Michael like a stranger, polite but completely detached, as if they shared no history whatsoever. Michael tried to apologize, tried to explain, tried to make amends. David's response was always the same, cordial but final. "There's nothing to discuss. I wish you well." But the energy behind it was pure erasure. Michael described the experience as more traumatic than any explicit conflict would have been. "I would have preferred if he screamed at me, if he told me I was a terrible brother, if he expressed rage or disappointment. At least then I would still exist to him. But instead, I just don't. I'm not angry, David. I'm not disappointing, David. I'm not hurtful, David. I'm no one to David. I don't exist in his psychological universe anymore, and that's a kind of death I wasn't prepared for." This is the INTJ INFJ door slam at its most complete, and from the outside, it can look like healthy boundary setting, like justified cutting off of toxic relationships, like appropriate protection of one's energy. But Jung would see something else, the shadow of the judge who cannot forgive, the innocent who cannot integrate their own capacity for betrayal, the superior consciousness that demands perfection from others because it cannot face its own darkness. From a Jungian perspective, the door slam represents a failure of shadow integration. Jung wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." The person you door slam is almost always carrying projected shadow material, some aspect of yourself that you cannot consciously acknowledge. When they betray you, disappoint you, or violate your standards, what they're actually doing is reflecting back a part of you that you've disowned. In David's case, what he couldn't face was his own capacity for failure, for disappointing others, for falling short of his own standards. Michael's business failure and subsequent deception weren't just betrayals, they were mirrors reflecting David's terror of his own potential unworthiness. Rather than integrate this shadow material, rather than recognize that Michael's humanity included weakness that David himself possessed, David eliminated the mirror. He didn't just end the relationship, he psychologically annihilated his brother to protect himself from seeing his own potential for failure. But here's what makes the door slam particularly dangerous. The INTJ, INFJ empath experiences it as righteous, necessary, and even compassionate. David genuinely believed he was protecting his peace, enforcing appropriate boundaries, removing toxicity from his life. He felt no guilt about the door slam, only the calm certainty that he had done what needed to be done. And this moral certainty is precisely what makes it shadow material. When you can destroy a relationship with zero doubt, zero ambivalence, zero question about whether you might be wrong, that's not consciousness. That's shadow possession. Jung warned about this specific psychological mechanism. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of everything to eventually become its opposite. The person who positions themselves as the most loving becomes the most ruthlessly rejecting. The person who values deep connection becomes capable of the most complete disconnection. The empath who feels everything becomes capable of feeling absolutely nothing, and they experience no contradiction because the shadow remains unconscious. The door slam also reveals another shadow aspect, the INTJ INFJ empath's terror of their own vulnerability. To stay in relationship with someone who has hurt you requires confronting your own capacity to be wounded, your own neediness, your own desire for connection, despite imperfection. It requires you to be human rather than God. And for the personality type that has built its identity on superior consciousness, on seeing clearly, on rising above the messy emotional entanglements that trap ordinary people, that kind of vulnerable humanity is intolerable. So they slam the door, not as boundary setting, but as self-protection against their own tender humanity, not as healthy detachment, but as psychological violence, enacted from a place of unacknowledged fear. They erase the other person to avoid facing their own capacity to be hurt, their own need for forgiveness, their own imperfect humanity that would be revealed if they stayed in the messy reality of relationship with a flawed human being. The question you need to ask yourself is, how many people have you door slammed in your life? And more importantly, what shadow material were they carrying for you? What aspect of your own darkness did they reflect that you couldn't integrate? Were they really irredeemably toxic, or were they human beings who disappointed your inflated standards? Were you protecting yourself, or were you protecting your ego's need to never be wrong about someone, never be vulnerable to betrayal, never have to face your own capacity for the very failures you couldn't forgive in them? Trait number 6. Moral absolutism as weapon. The door slam doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the behavioral expression of a deeper psychological pattern, moral absolutism. The INTJ and INFJ empath develops an internal ethical framework so sophisticated, so comprehensive, and so absolute that they position themselves as judge, jury, and executioner of others' worthiness. And once they've rendered judgment, it's final. Jung wrote extensively about this danger in his work on the inflation of moral consciousness. He observed that certain individuals, particularly those with strong introverted feeling, FI, or introverted thinking, TI functions, develop internal value systems that become impermeable to external feedback. They create their own moral law, and that law becomes more real to them than any external authority, any relationship, any human complexity that might challenge it. For the INTJ, this often manifests as logical absolutism. You violated principle X, therefore consequence Y is not only justified, but morally required. For the INFJ, it manifests as value absolutism. You betrayed value X, therefore you are fundamentally incompatible with my understanding of integrity. In both cases, the result is the same. Human complexity collapses into binary judgment. You're either worthy or unworthy, either aligned with truth or corrupted by falsehood, either on the side of consciousness or lost in unconsciousness. And once you've been judged unworthy, there is no appeal, no rehabilitation, no possibility of redemption. Let me tell you about Catherine, an INFJ who worked as a spiritual teacher. Catherine had developed a sophisticated ethical framework based on years of study: Buddhism, Stoicism, Jungian psychology, trauma healing. She could articulate her values with remarkable clarity: authenticity, integrity, consciousness, compassion, truth-telling. And she held these values with absolute conviction. They weren't aspirations for her. They were commandments, not just for herself, but for everyone in her orbit. Catherine attracted followers who were drawn to her clarity, her wisdom, her apparent embodiment of these principles. She created a community around her teachings, and that community flourished for years. But slowly, a pattern emerged that only became visible in retrospect. Anyone who questioned Catherine, anyone who offered critical feedback, anyone who failed to meet her standards of consciousness, they disappeared. One by one, longtime students found themselves exiled, sometimes explicitly, Catherine would deliver a devastating assessment of their lack of readiness for this work and suggest they find another teacher. More often implicitly, Catherine would become increasingly cold, increasingly distant, increasingly unavailable until the student got the message and left on their own. What all these exiled students had in common was that they had violated one of Catherine's unspoken absolute standards. One student challenged Catherine's interpretation of a Buddhist teaching in front of the group. Exile for disrespect. One student expressed anger at Catherine for canceling a scheduled session without much notice. Exile for unconscious aggression. One student admitted to lying to their partner about something minor. Exile for lack of integrity. One student gained weight and stopped exercising regularly. Exile for not honoring the body-temple principle. Were these students perfect? No. Were their behaviors sometimes problematic? Probably. But here's what Catherine never examined: her own shadow material being projected onto each person she judged. The student who challenged her teaching was reflecting Catherine's own unconscious doubt about her qualifications. The student who expressed anger was reflecting Catherine's own rage at being humanly limited. The student who lied was reflecting Catherine's own tendency to conceal imperfection behind spiritual persona. The student who gained weight was reflecting Catherine's own terror of losing control. But Catherine couldn't see any of this. From her perspective, she was simply maintaining high standards, protecting the integrity of the teaching, ensuring that only truly committed students remained in the sacred container she'd created. She felt no guilt about the exiles, only the calm certainty that she was serving a higher purpose, upholding values that were more important than any individual relationship. This is moral absolutism as shadow material, using your sophisticated ethical framework not in service of consciousness, but in service of ego protection, using your values as weapons to eliminate anyone who threatens your inflation, using your principles as justification for behavior that Jung would recognize as pure shadow, the ruthless elimination of whatever reflects your own unintegrated darkness. The truly disturbing part of Catherine's story came when one of her oldest students, Emma, had the courage to confront the pattern directly. Emma had been with Catherine for 8 years, had done profound healing work, had become a teacher herself. But Emma had also watched dozens of people be exiled, and she'd started recognizing the pattern. Catherine could never be wrong. Catherine could never be challenged. Catherine's values were absolute, and anyone who didn't embody them perfectly was cast out. So Emma, from a place of genuine love and concern, tried to address this with Catherine directly. She came to a private session and said, "I'm worried about you. I see you cutting people out of your life constantly, and I wonder if you're aware of the pattern." These were real relationships, real students doing real work, and you ended all of them with a certainty that feels inflated to me. Have you considered that your moral standards might sometimes be defenses against your own vulnerability? Catherine's response was, from Emma's description, chilling. No anger, no defensiveness, just complete closure. Catherine said, "I see that you're not ready for this level of teaching. The work I'm doing requires people who can trust my discernment without projecting their own limitations onto me. I wish you well in your journey." And that was it. 8 years of relationship erased. Emma tried to follow up, tried to explain, tried to repair. Catherine's response was the same each time, polite but final. "I have no doubt about my decision. I wish you peace." This is moral absolutism in its most dangerous form, the complete inability to question your own judgments, the inflation that positions you as the arbiter of others' worthiness, the shadow material of playing God while claiming to serve higher values. Jung warned that this kind of moral inflation is more dangerous than obvious immorality because it carries the conviction of righteousness, the certainty of being on the side of truth. And here's what makes it particularly dangerous in the INTJ, INFJ empath. Their moral framework is often genuinely sophisticated. They have done deep work. They have integrated significant shadow material. They do operate from more consciousness than many people around them. So when they judge someone as unworthy, when they door slam someone for violating their standards, when they exile someone from their life, it's almost impossible for them to question whether they might be wrong, because they have evidence of their superior judgment. They have a track record of being right about people. They have the validation of their own psychological development. But Jung's warning applies precisely here. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. What if your sophisticated moral framework is partly a defense against accepting your own capacity for the very imperfections you judge so harshly in others? What if your high standards are partly a way to never have to face your own ordinariness, your own ongoing struggles, your own human messiness that doesn't fit the narrative of the conscious evolved being you've identified with? Think about your own patterns of moral judgment. When you decide someone is unworthy of relationship, do you ever question that decision? Do you ever consider you might be wrong? Do you ever examine what shadow material they might be carrying for you? Or do your judgments feel so clear, so obviously correct, so aligned with your sophisticated value system that doubt never even enters your consciousness? Have you noticed a pattern of people disappointing you, betraying you, revealing themselves to be less conscious than you thought? Have you noticed yourself repeatedly being the one who sees someone's unworthiness before others do, who has to make the hard decision to cut them off, who maintains standards that others find too rigid? Have you noticed that your moral clarity never seems to implicate yourself, that you're always the wronged party, the betrayed one, the person maintaining integrity while others fall short? If so, you're not operating from integrated consciousness. You're operating from shadow possession, wielding moral absolutism as a weapon that protects your ego from confronting its own imperfection, its own capacity for the very failures you judge so harshly in others. Jung wrote, "If only people could realize what an enrichment it is to find one's own guilt, what a sense of honor and spiritual dignity." But the INTJ, INFJ empath with an unconscious God complex cannot find their own guilt. They can only project it onto others, judge it, and execute it through door slams and permanent deletions. The path toward integration requires something brutal. You need to reach out to at least one person you've door slammed and acknowledge that you might have been wrong. Not wrong about what they did. Maybe they really did betray you, disappoint you, violate your standards. But wrong about the finality, wrong about the righteousness, wrong about your inability to see your own shadow material in their reflection. And if you find that absolutely impossible to do, if every fiber of your being resists the idea that you might have been inflated in your judgment, that's your signal. That's the shadow screaming to remain unconscious. That's the moral absolutism that has become your prison, masquerading as your liberation. Because the truth that Jung discovered, the truth that will set you free if you can bear it, is this: the people you judge most harshly are carrying your disowned shadow. The betrayals you cannot forgive are reflections of capacities you cannot acknowledge in yourself. The standards you wield like weapons are defenses against your own terrifying humanity. And the door slams you execute with such moral certainty are not acts of consciousness. They're acts of violence against the parts of yourself you've projected onto others because you lack the courage to integrate them. Comment below if you've recognized your own moral absolutism, not to justify it, not to defend the righteousness of your judgments, but to claim the shadow that wields judgment as a weapon against your own vulnerability. Because the next chapter takes us even deeper into the darkness, into the ways INTJ, INFJ empaths don't just judge and exile, but systematically collect psychological leverage and control narratives with such sophistication that they become the hidden puppet masters of entire social systems. But before we descend further, sit with these questions. Who have you erased from your life with absolute certainty? What would it cost your ego to admit you might have been wrong? What would happen to your identity as the conscious one if you had to face your own capacity for the unconsciousness you judge so harshly in others? The answers will destroy the comfortable myth of your moral superiority, but on the other side of that destruction is something far more valuable: your humanity. We've journeyed through 5 traits so far, penetrating perception, prophetic pattern recognition, atmospheric control, strategic vulnerability, and the door slam combined with moral absolutism. But before we continue into the final 6 traits, we need to pause and examine the deeper Jungian framework that explains why these traits are so uniquely dangerous in the INTJ and INFJ empath. We need to understand the architecture of their psyche, the relationship between their brilliant persona and their catastrophic shadow. Carl Jung spent his entire career exploring a fundamental truth about human psychology. We are not who we think we are, or more precisely, we are far more than who we think we are, and far more dangerous. Every human being, Jung discovered, constructs a persona, a social mask that we present to the world and, crucially, to ourselves. This persona is necessary. It's how we function in society, how we organize our identity, how we navigate the complex social world. The problem isn't the persona itself. The problem is what the persona conceals, the shadow. The shadow in Jungian psychology isn't simply the bad parts of yourself. It's everything you've excluded from your conscious identity. It includes your disowned capacities, the rage the peaceful person can't acknowledge, the cruelty the kind person can't admit, the selfishness the generous person can't see. But it also includes positive qualities you've rejected, the power the victim can't claim, the beauty the self-deprecating person can't recognize, the wisdom the self-doubter won't trust. For the INTJ and INFJ empath, the persona is particularly sophisticated and particularly dangerous. These personality types construct elaborate identities as helpers, advisors, healers, seers, truth-tellers, or conscious witnesses. Their persona is built on their genuine gifts: empathy, insight, wisdom, depth. They really do possess these qualities. The persona isn't false, it's partial, and what it conceals is a shadow so powerful that most INTJ, INFJ empaths go their entire lives without consciously recognizing it. The shadow concealed beneath the healer persona is the destroyer. Beneath the helper persona is the controller. Beneath the truth-teller persona is the manipulator. Beneath the conscious witness is the tyrant. Beneath the wounded healer is the person who needs others to remain wounded so they can maintain their identity as the healer. Jung discovered a principle he called enantiodromia, the tendency of everything in the psyche to eventually transform into its opposite. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The more identified you are with being the helper, the more your unconscious will compensate by developing a destroyer energy that operates without your awareness. The more you position yourself as the empath who feels everything, the more your shadow will develop the capacity to feel absolutely nothing when it serves your unconscious agenda. This isn't theoretical. This is the lived reality of every INTJ and INFJ empath who hasn't done deep shadow work, and the shadow doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with horns and a pitchfork. It operates through the very traits we've been exploring, using your empathy as manipulation, your insight as control, your wisdom as domination, your vulnerability as strategy, your moral clarity as violence. Let me map the specific shadow archetypes that the INTJ and INFJ empath tend to embody unconsciously. The sorcerer, INTJ dominant. This is the shadow archetype of the person who uses knowledge as power. The sorcerer possesses secret wisdom, sees what others cannot see, and uses that vision to control outcomes while maintaining the persona of the objective observer. The sorcerer doesn't use overt force. That would be beneath them. They use information, insight, and strategic positioning to architect realities that serve their interests while appearing to simply be following logic and truth. The sorcerer's motto, "I'm not controlling anything, I'm just seeing clearly and acting accordingly." The Dark Mother, INFJ dominant. This is the shadow archetype of the person who nurtures as a means of control. The Dark Mother creates dependency, offers love conditionally, and maintains power by being the irreplaceable source of emotional sustenance in others' lives. She or he archetypes aren't gender-specific, genuinely cares, genuinely wants to help, but cannot release control. The Dark Mother's children never fully individuate because that would threaten her identity. Her motto, "I'm not controlling you, I just know what you need better than you do." The Machiavellian strategist. This shadow archetype operates through long-term social chess. Every relationship is assessed for strategic value. Every interaction is calibrated for maximum advantage. Every revelation of authenticity is actually a calculated move. But the strategist never acknowledges the game they're playing. They maintain the persona of simply being naturally socially intelligent, naturally good at reading people, naturally attuned to dynamics. The enlightened despot. This is perhaps the most dangerous shadow archetype for the INTJ-INFJ empath. The enlightened despot genuinely is more conscious than many people around them. They really have done the work. They really do see more clearly, but they use that consciousness as justification for control. They believe their superior awareness gives them not just the right, but the obligation to make decisions for others, to guide others' lives, to impose their vision because they know better. And they do all of this while maintaining absolute moral certainty. The enlightened despot's motto, "I'm not being tyrannical. I'm serving a higher purpose that you're not conscious enough to understand." Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." For the INTJ and INFJ empath, the shadow is particularly black and particularly dense because their persona is so bright. They've identified so strongly with being the helper, the healer, the wise one, that they've created an equal and opposite unconscious identity as the destroyer, the controller, the tyrant. Let me tell you the story of Rebecca to make this concrete. Rebecca was an INFJ who spent 15 years building a reputation as a beloved community leader. She ran a nonprofit focused on social justice, facilitated healing circles, organized community events, and was universally regarded as one of the most conscious, compassionate people anyone had ever met. People came to Rebecca for advice, for emotional support, for wisdom during crisis. She had become, quite literally, the mother of her community. But beneath Rebecca's healer persona, an unconscious shadow was operating. Rebecca had surrounded herself with people who needed her, who validated her identity as the wise helper, who confirmed her specialness by constantly seeking her guidance. And anyone who threatened that identity, anyone who became too independent, anyone who offered feedback that challenged her, anyone who might rival her position as the community's emotional center, was systematically undermined. The undermining was never overt. Rebecca would never openly attack someone. Instead, she would express concern about their readiness for leadership. She would share observations about their unhealed trauma affecting their judgment. she would create opportunities that mysteriously never materialized for them. She would subtly redirect community resources away from their initiatives. And she would do all of this while maintaining perfect plausible deniability and genuine care for their well-being. One particular incident revealed Rebecca's shadow in a way she could no longer deny. A young woman named Alicia had been part of the community for 3 years, doing significant healing work, developing her own gifts as a facilitator. Alicia proposed creating a new healing circle, specifically for younger members of the community who felt the existing circles were too focused on Rebecca's generation's concerns. It was a reasonable proposal, presented respectfully, with no intention of competing with Rebecca's work. Rebecca's response was telling. She publicly praised Alicia's initiative while privately expressing concerns to key community members. She worried that Alicia might be moving too fast in her healing journey and taking on responsibility before she's ready. She suggested that Alicia's desire to create something separate might indicate unhealed separation trauma that needed to be addressed before she could serve others effectively. She never directly opposed the new circle, but she created enough doubt, enough subtle resistance, that the proposal died without Rebecca ever having to take a visible stance against it. Alicia, confused and hurt, eventually left the community, and Rebecca's shadow was temporarily victorious. The threat to her centrality had been eliminated, and she'd maintained her persona as the supportive elder who only wanted what was best for everyone. But something was gnawing at Rebecca. For the first time, she felt genuine discomfort about her behavior. Some part of her recognized that she had sabotaged Alicia, that she had used her influence destructively, that her concerns had been rationalizations for protecting her position rather than genuine care for Alicia's well-being. This discomfort was Rebecca's psyche trying to make her shadow conscious. Rebecca did something that most people in her position never do. She sought Jungian analysis, and through that process, she was forced to confront the shadow that had been operating beneath her healer persona for years. She had to face the dark mother archetype that needed others to remain dependent, the enlightened despot who couldn't tolerate rivals, the controller who used care as manipulation. The excavation was devastating. Rebecca had to revisit dozens of relationships and recognize the shadow patterns, the students she'd undermined, the potential leaders she'd subtly discouraged, the people she'd exiled for getting too big, the ways she'd created a psychological kingdom where she was the irreplaceable queen. She had to face the uncomfortable truth that her community leadership, while genuine in many ways, had also been serving her unconscious need for power, for validation, for being special. Most painfully, Rebecca had to confront the childhood wound beneath it all. Growing up in a chaotic family where being the helper, the peacemaker, the one who could sense everyone's emotions and manage the atmosphere, was how she earned love and avoided abandonment. Her identity as the healer wasn't just a persona. It was a survival strategy that had calcified into her entire sense of self, and the shadow that emerged from that survival strategy was the terrorizing possibility that if she wasn't needed, if she wasn't the most conscious one, if she wasn't irreplaceable, she would be abandoned, unloved, worthless. This is the architecture of the INTJ, INFJ empath's psyche. A brilliant persona built on real gifts, concealing a catastrophic shadow built on unhealed wounds. And the shadow uses the very gifts that built the persona. Your empathy becomes the tool for manipulation. Your insight becomes the weapon for control. Your wisdom becomes the justification for tyranny. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For the INTJ, INFJ empath, making the darkness conscious requires facing several unbearable truths. First, your empathy is not pure. It serves your ego as much as it serves others. You don't just want to help people. You need to help people in order to maintain your identity as someone special, someone necessary, someone superior to those who haven't developed your level of consciousness. Second, your insights about others are often projections of your own shadow. The unconsciousness you perceive so clearly in them is frequently your own unconsciousness reflected back to you. The patterns you predict are sometimes patterns you're unconsciously creating by influencing the very outcomes you claim to be objectively observing. Third, your moral clarity is often moral inflation. Your sophisticated ethical framework serves partly as a defense against facing your own ethical failures, your own capacity for harm, your own ongoing struggle with the very qualities you judge harshly in others. Fourth, your healer identity requires others to remain wounded. On some unconscious level, you need people to be broken so you can be the one who fixes them. You need people to be less conscious so you can be the most conscious. You need people to need you because without that need, who are you? Fifth, the very traits that make you capable of profound good, your empathy, insight, wisdom, depth, make you equally capable of profound harm. You are not safely positioned on the side of light. You are standing at the edge between healer and destroyer, and which direction you move depends entirely on whether you're willing to make your shadow conscious. Rebecca's story doesn't end with the comfortable resolution most personal development narratives promise. Shadow integration isn't a one-time achievement, it's an ongoing practice. Rebecca had to fundamentally restructure her relationship with her community. She had to step back from positions of centrality. She had to actively support potential rivals instead of undermining them. She had to catch herself in real time when her shadow patterns emerged, the subtle put-downs disguised as concern, the strategic withholding of support, the need to be consulted on every decision. Most difficult of all, Rebecca had to face the loss of her old identity. She could no longer be the beloved community mother, the irreplaceable wise one, the person everyone turned to in crisis. She had to become something less grandiose and more human, a person with genuine gifts who also has genuine limitations, someone who can help without needing to be necessary, someone who can offer wisdom without needing to be the wisest. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who your persona claims to be. For the INTJ, INFJ empath, individuation requires accepting that you are not the healer. You are a human being capable of both healing and harming. You are not the seer. You are a person with developed intuition that's still filtered through your biases and wounds. You are not the conscious one. You are someone engaged in the lifelong struggle with unconsciousness, just like everyone else, no matter how much shadow work you've done. The persona must die for the integrated self to emerge, and that death feels catastrophic because the persona has been your entire identity, your source of meaning, your protection against the terror of your own ordinariness. But Jung's promise was that on the other side of that death is something infinitely more valuable, genuine wholeness, not the inflated wholeness of the persona that claims to have transcended shadow, but the human wholeness that includes both your capacity for healing and your capacity for harm, both your wisdom and your blindness, both your empathy and your potential for manipulation. This is why the INTJ, INFJ empath is so dangerous, because the gap between their conscious self-image and their unconscious shadow material is catastrophic. They believe they're incapable of the manipulation, control, and tyranny they're actually enacting. They wield enormous power while claiming they're just being authentic, just using their natural gifts, just serving consciousness. And this is why consciousness is the only solution, not trying to eliminate the shadow, not pretending you don't have these dangerous capacities, but bringing them into awareness so you can choose, moment by moment, whether you're operating from integrated wholeness or shadow possession. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But the INTJ, INFJ empath operating from shadow doesn't allow genuine meeting. They maintain control, manage the reaction, architect the transformation, and in doing so, remain untransformed themselves. The shadow's job is to keep you safe from the vulnerability of genuine encounter, genuine challenge, genuine transformation. So here's the question you need to sit with. Are you willing to let your healer persona die? Are you willing to face the destroyer shadow it's been concealing? Are you willing to admit that your empathy has been weaponized? Your insight has been used for control. Your wisdom has justified tyranny. Are you willing to recognize that the people you've helped have also been harmed by the unconscious shadow operating beneath your helping? If you can answer yes, genuinely yes, not the spiritual bypass yes that your persona might offer, then you're ready for what comes next. Because the next 5 traits we're going to explore show exactly how the INTJ, INFJ empath's shadow operates in the world, collecting leverage, controlling narratives, engineering social systems, weaponizing selective empathy, and creating psychological kingdoms where they reign as the unconscious monarch. Comment below if you've recognized your own shadow archetypes, the sorcerer, the dark mother, the Machiavellian strategist, the enlightened despot. Name which one you most identify with, not to shame yourself, but to claim what's been operating unconsciously, because Jung's entire psychology was built on this insight. The shadow that remains unconscious will destroy you and everyone around you. The shadow that becomes conscious transforms into power. We're past the halfway point now. The journey gets darker from here, but darkness is where transformation happens. Let's continue. We return now to the specific traits, armed with a deeper understanding of the persona shadow architecture that makes them so dangerous. The next 2 traits reveal how the INTJ, INFJ empath functions as an amateur psychoanalyst, systematically excavating others' unconscious material and, most disturbingly, collecting that material as psychological leverage. Trait number 7, unconscious archaeology. There's a particular kind of conversation that happens with highly developed INTJ and INFJ empaths. You're talking about something seemingly mundane, your weekend plans, a disagreement at work, your childhood pet, and suddenly you feel exposed. Not because they've asked probing questions, not because they've challenged you directly, but because you can feel them seeing through the surface content to something deeper, something you weren't consciously intending to reveal. And then they say something specific, something that hits with such precision that you wonder if you've been transparent this entire time. That story about your childhood pet, it sounds like you learned very early that your love wasn't enough to keep things from being taken away from you. Or the way you described that work disagreement, I noticed you took responsibility for the other person's feelings before you even mentioned your own needs. When did you learn that your needs were less important than keeping others comfortable? These aren't general observations. These are surgical strikes into your unconscious, and the INTJ, INFJ empath delivers them with such casual precision that you're simultaneously grateful for being seen and disturbed by being penetrated. This is unconscious archaeology, the relentless drive to map the complete psychological structure of everyone they encounter. Jung called this the intuitive function operating in service of what he termed reductive analysis, the process of tracing current behaviors back to their unconscious origins, excavating layer after layer until the archetypal foundations are exposed. For the INTJ, INFJ empath, this isn't something they consciously choose to do. It's as automatic as breathing. Their NIFE or NIT function stack creates a compulsive need to understand the hidden machinery beneath people's surface presentations. They can't have a simple conversation without unconsciously running parallel processing. What childhood wound is this behavior revealing? What attachment pattern is this communication style indicating? What defense mechanism is being deployed here? What archetype is being enacted? Let me tell you about James, an INTJ consultant who specialized in organizational development. James had an extraordinary reputation for being able to diagnose workplace dysfunction with startling speed and accuracy. CEOs would hire him, and within a week, James would provide insights into their executive teams that seemed impossible, given the limited time frame. But what James was doing wasn't impossible. It was unconscious archaeology operating at master level. In a single 2-hour meeting, James could identify the CFO's childhood as the responsible eldest child who learned to earn love through competence, now playing out as hyper-control and inability to delegate. The CMO's wound of being the overlooked middle child, now manifesting as attention-seeking through increasingly risky marketing strategies. The COO's abandonment trauma from an alcoholic parent, now creating codependent relationships with underperforming team members that she can't bring herself to fire. Was James right? Disturbingly, yes. When these executives later confided in James, his archaeological excavations were confirmed with unsettling accuracy. The CFO's father had been emotionally distant, only expressing pride when James brought home perfect report cards. The CMO had indeed been overshadowed by high-achieving siblings. The COO's mother had been a functional alcoholic that the family never addressed. But here's where James's gift became dangerous. He now possessed knowledge these executives hadn't consciously chosen to share. He had penetrated their psychological defenses, excavated their unconscious material, and mapped their shadow territories, all without explicit consent. And this created a fundamental power asymmetry in every subsequent interaction. The executives felt simultaneously seen and violated. James knew things about them that they barely admitted to themselves. And while James didn't overtly use this information against them, its existence changed everything. The CFO couldn't assert authority without wondering if James saw it as compensating for childhood inadequacy. The CMO couldn't pitch bold ideas without questioning whether James perceived it as wounded attention-seeking. The COO couldn't advocate for giving employees second chances without worrying that James viewed it as unhealed codependency. This is the danger of unconscious archaeology. You now hold people's psychological secrets, and even if you never weaponize them directly, their awareness that you know fundamentally alters the power dynamics. You've created what Jung called asymmetric psychological relationship, where one person knows the other far more deeply than they're known in return. James himself didn't initially recognize the ethical problem with his archaeological excavations. From his perspective, he was simply doing his job well, using his natural gifts to help organizations function more effectively. He genuinely believed that his insights served his clients' best interests. What he couldn't see was his own shadow motivation, the unconscious need to be the one who knows, the one who sees what others can't see, the one who possesses secret knowledge that confirms his superiority. The turning point came when James's long-term partner, Rachel, finally confronted him about the same pattern in their personal relationship. Rachel said, "I feel like I can't have a single thought or feeling without you immediately analyzing its unconscious origins. I can't express frustration without you connecting it to my relationship with my father. I can't make a decision without you pointing out the childhood pattern it's repeating. I don't feel like I'm in a relationship with you. I feel like I'm being psychoanalyzed by you. And the worst part is that you're usually right. which makes me feel completely powerless. You know me better than I know myself, and you use that knowledge to stay in control." James was shocked. He had never thought of his psychological insights as controlling. He thought he was helping Rachel become more conscious, supporting her growth, offering valuable perspective. But Rachel's words forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His unconscious archaeology wasn't purely in service of others' well-being. It was also serving his need to maintain the power position, to never be vulnerable to being truly known in return, to never have to face someone who could see through him the way he saw through everyone else. Jung wrote about this exact dynamic in his work on the analyst-patient relationship. He warned that analysts who use their psychological insight to maintain superiority over their patients are not serving individuation. They're serving their own unconscious inflation. And the same principle applies to anyone with highly developed psychological perception operating outside clinical contexts. The shadow of unconscious archaeology is using your insight as a weapon that maintains power asymmetry, penetrates boundaries without consent, and positions you as the knower while keeping others in the position of the known. It's using your gift of perception to avoid the vulnerability of being perceived, using your ability to see others' wounds to avoid facing your own, using your archaeological skills to excavate everyone except yourself. Trait number 8, the leverage collector. Now we arrive at perhaps the most disturbing trait. What happens with all that excavated unconscious material? For many INTJ, INFJ empaths, even those operating with good intentions, the insights they've gathered become unconscious leverage, psychological ammunition that could devastate someone if deployed strategically. Let me be very clear about what I'm describing. This isn't necessarily conscious blackmail. It's not walking around with explicit plans to use people's secrets against them. It's something far more subtle and far more insidious. You now know someone's deepest vulnerabilities, their core wounds, their hidden shames, and that knowledge creates a power differential that fundamentally shapes every interaction, even if the knowledge is never explicitly referenced. Jung called this holding the shadow, when one person possesses conscious awareness of another person's unconscious material. In a therapeutic relationship, this is necessary and potentially healing if handled ethically. But in personal, professional, and social relationships, it creates what Jung described as psychic tyranny, where one person's awareness of another's shadow gives them enormous unconscious influence. Let me tell you about Angela, an INFJ who worked in nonprofit leadership. Angela had a gift for building deep connections quickly. People opened up to her, shared their struggles, revealed their fears and insecurities. And Angela genuinely cared. She wasn't manipulative in any overt sense. She remembered people's stories, checked in on their well-being, offered support during difficult times. But Angela also kept meticulous mental files on everyone in her professional orbit, not through explicit record-keeping, just through the natural operation of her dominant I function combined with her empathic perception. She knew which board member was insecure about their intelligence because they'd never finished college. She knew which major donor was desperately trying to compensate for childhood poverty through conspicuous generosity. She knew which colleague was terrified of being seen as difficult because they'd been conditioned to be agreeable. She knew which volunteer was using service to others as a way to avoid facing their own depression. And while Angela never overtly weaponized this information, its existence shaped every strategic decision she made. When the insecure board member questioned her budget proposal, Angela unconsciously referenced his business success in ways that made him feel validated enough to withdraw his objection. She'd identified his vulnerability and knew exactly how to neutralize it. When the donor threatened to reduce funding, Angela unconsciously framed her appeal in language that spoke directly to his compensatory generosity. She'd excavated his wound and knew which emotional buttons to push. When the agreeable colleague had a legitimate concern, Angela unconsciously made expressing that concern feel like being difficult, activating the very fear she knew would silence them. None of this was conscious manipulation. Angela wasn't sitting in her office, calculating how to exploit people's vulnerabilities. She was simply using her sophisticated understanding of human psychology to navigate organizational politics effectively. But that's exactly what makes leverage collection so dangerous. It operates at the unconscious level, allowing you to wield enormous power while maintaining complete deniability about possessing that power. The psychological mechanism Jung identified is what he called massa confusa, the undifferentiated power that comes from holding others' shadow material without their conscious awareness. When you know someone's deepest wounds, you gain influence over them that operates beneath their conscious defenses. They can't protect themselves from manipulation they can't perceive. And you can use this influence while genuinely believing you're just being naturally attuned, naturally empathic, naturally skilled at human relations. Angela's reckoning came through a former employee named Marcus, who had the psychological sophistication to recognize what was happening. Marcus had worked for Angela for 3 years, during which he'd shared significant personal information: his struggles with addiction in his 20s, his complex relationship with his authoritarian father, his fear of being seen as aggressive because of racist stereotypes about black men in professional settings. When Marcus left the organization, he took some time to process the experience, and he realized something disturbing. Angela had systematically used his vulnerabilities to manage him. When he'd tried to advocate for programmatic changes that challenged Angela's vision, she'd unconsciously framed disagreement as aggressive in ways that activated his deepest fear. When he'd wanted recognition for his contributions, she'd positioned that desire as residual addiction-seeking behavior, needing external validation. When he'd questioned her leadership decisions, she'd suggested his father issues were making him rebel against necessary authority. Marcus wrote Angela a letter that shook her to her core. "You collected my vulnerabilities like ammunition. You never fired them directly. You're too sophisticated for that. But you held them. And their presence in your psychological arsenal fundamentally shaped our entire professional relationship. I was never free to challenge you, to disagree with you, to set boundaries with you because you knew too much. You had leverage, and even though you never consciously used it, the power dynamic it created was tyrannical. I felt psychologically colonized by you." Angela's first response was defensive outrage. She had genuinely cared about Marcus. She had supported his professional development. She had advocated for his promotion. How dare he accuse her of manipulation? But Marcus's words haunted her because deep down she knew they were true. She began examining her pattern with brutal honesty, and what she discovered was terrifying. She had created an entire professional network structured around asymmetric psychological knowledge. She knew everyone's vulnerabilities, but she revealed very little of her own. She had positioned herself at the center of a web of relationships where she held leverage, not through formal authority, but through psychological insight that gave her influence others couldn't see or resist. This is leverage collection as shadow material, unconsciously accumulating psychological power over others through your empathic excavations, creating dependency structures where people can't challenge you without facing their own vulnerabilities, wielding influence that operates beneath conscious awareness, yours and theirs. Jung warned about this specific danger in his work on what he called the analyst's inflation. He wrote that those who possess deep psychological insight into others must engage in constant self-examination, or they will inevitably use that insight to maintain power rather than serve consciousness. The same applies to anyone with highly developed empathic and intuitive abilities. The question you need to ask yourself is brutally simple. Do you keep mental files on people's weaknesses just in case? Do you remember their vulnerabilities with more clarity than you remember their strengths? Do you unconsciously catalog information that could be useful if you ever needed to influence, manipulate, or control them? Do you feel a sense of security from knowing things about people that they don't know you know? Be honest. When someone shares something vulnerable with you, what happens in your psyche? Is there a small part of you that files that information away, that notes it as potentially useful, that experiences subtle satisfaction from possessing that knowledge? When someone confides their deepest wound, do you hold it with sacred care, or do you unconsciously categorize it as leverage? Think about your relationships. How many of them are structured around you knowing more about others than they know about you? How many people in your life have revealed their shadow material to you while you've maintained your healer persona, never revealing the full scope of your own darkness? How many relationships have you structured, consciously or unconsciously, around asymmetric psychological knowledge that gives you power? The shadow of the mind reader, the unconscious archaeologist who becomes the leverage collector, is using your empathic gifts to accumulate power while denying you're accumulating power. It's penetrating people's psychological boundaries without consent, holding their shadow material without their awareness, and using that holding to maintain influence that they can't resist because they can't consciously perceive it. And the most disturbing part? You can do all of this with genuinely good intentions. You can care about people, want to help them, support their growth, and still be wielding tyrannical psychological power through your accumulated knowledge of their vulnerabilities. The shadow doesn't require malicious intent, it only requires unconsciousness. Jung's solution was radical transparency. If you're going to hold someone's shadow material, they need to know you're holding it. If you've excavated someone's unconscious, they need to have the opportunity to excavate yours. If you possess psychological leverage, it needs to be made conscious and, in most cases, released. Otherwise, you're not in genuine relationship. You're in a power dynamic disguised as intimacy. The path toward integration requires something brutal. You need to acknowledge the leverage you've collected, recognize how it's shaped your relationships, and consciously release it. This might mean telling people, I realize I know intimate things about you that create a power imbalance between us. I want you to know that I'm consciously choosing not to use that knowledge as influence, and I'm open to you knowing equally intimate things about me. It might mean admitting to yourself, and perhaps to others, that your empathic archaeology hasn't been purely in service of their well-being, that you've been collecting information that serves your need for power, your need for control, your need to never be the vulnerable one in any relationship. If you find that almost impossible to do, that's your signal. That's the shadow screaming to remain unconscious, to keep its leverage, to maintain the power position that protects you from ever having to face genuine equality, genuine vulnerability, genuine relationship, where you don't hold all the psychological cards. Comment below if you've recognized yourself as a leverage collector. What vulnerabilities have you held without consent? What psychological power have you wielded while claiming you were just being naturally empathic? Who needs to know that you've been holding their shadow as leverage? The answers will be uncomfortable, but consciousness is always uncomfortable. And we're about to get even more uncomfortable as we explore the final three traits, how the INTJ, INFJ empath becomes a reality weaver, a social engineer, and ultimately a creator of psychological kingdoms where they reign as unconscious monarchs. The descent continues. Stay with me. We've seen how the INTJ, INFJ empath excavates unconscious material and collects leverage. Now we explore what they do with that power at a systems level. They don't just influence individuals, they architect entire social realities. They control narratives with such sophistication that people don't realize they're living inside someone else's story. They engineer social dynamics so precisely that entire communities organize around them without ever recognizing the gravitational force shaping their orbits. Trait number 9, the story you don't know. There's a particular form of power that most people never recognize because it operates at the level of narrative rather than force. It's the power to determine how events are interpreted, how history is remembered, which truths are centered and which are marginalized, who gets cast as hero and who as villain. This is narrative control, and the INTJ, INFJ empath possesses an almost supernatural ability to wield it. Jung understood narrative as fundamental to human consciousness. He wrote, "Life behaves as if it were going somewhere, and we project meaning and purpose onto its unfolding through the stories we tell." But Jung also recognized something darker. Those who control the narratives control reality itself, because humans don't experience events directly. They experience the stories they tell about events. And the INTJ, INFJ empath, with their penetrating insight into how people construct meaning, becomes a master storyteller who shapes reality for everyone in their orbit. Let me introduce you to Thomas, an INTJ executive at a mid-sized tech company. Thomas wasn't the CEO, he was the Chief Strategy Officer, a position that gave him influence without the visible spotlight of ultimate authority. And Thomas had perfected what he called strategic framing, the ability to control how events were interpreted without ever overtly lying or manipulating. Here's how it worked. The company was going through a difficult transition. Revenue growth had stalled. 2 major clients had left. Morale was declining. The executive team was divided about the path forward. The CEO wanted aggressive expansion. The CFO wanted cost-cutting and consolidation. The COO wanted to focus on operational excellence. Each had legitimate arguments, and the board was watching closely to see how the leadership team would navigate the crisis. Thomas didn't openly advocate for any particular strategy. Instead, he controlled the narrative frame through which all strategies would be evaluated. In board meetings, he would begin with what seemed like objective analysis. Before we discuss specific approaches, I think it's important we're clear about the real story of what's happening here. And then Thomas would tell a story, one carefully constructed to make certain interpretations seem obvious and others seem naive. The real story, Thomas would say, is that we've been successful despite having operational systems that can't scale. We've grown on the strength of our early product market fit and our founder's vision, but we've never built the infrastructure needed for sustainable success. The client losses weren't random. They were canaries in the coal mine, telling us that our operational weakness is now visible to the market. The question isn't whether we need operational excellence. That's not negotiable. The question is whether we can build that foundation while still being aggressive enough to maintain market position. Notice what Thomas did. He didn't argue against the CEO's expansion vision or the CFO's cost-cutting approach. He reframed the entire conversation so that the COO's operational excellence became the obvious priority, while making anyone who disagreed seem like they were missing the real story. And he did it all while appearing to simply be clarifying the situation objectively. But it wasn't objective. Thomas had a preferred outcome. He wanted the COO to gain influence because the COO was politically aligned with him and operationally dependent on his strategic thinking. But Thomas never said that. He never overtly campaigned for the COO's approach. He simply controlled the narrative frame, and the narrative did the rest. Over the next 6 months, this pattern repeated across dozens of decisions. Thomas had an extraordinary ability to control which information surfaced, when, how it was contextualized, what story it was embedded within. When the aggressive expansion approach hit an obstacle, Thomas made sure that obstacle was framed as evidence confirming his original narrative. When operational improvements showed results, Thomas made sure those results were highly visible and interpreted as vindication of the operational focus. By the end of the year, the company had indeed shifted toward operational excellence as its primary strategy. The COO had been promoted to president. The CEO's influence had diminished, and Thomas had orchestrated the entire transformation without ever being seen as the architect. He was simply the person who helped everyone understand the real story of what was happening. This is narrative control at master level, and it's extraordinarily dangerous because it's nearly invisible. Thomas wasn't lying. Every fact he presented was accurate. He wasn't overtly manipulating. He never forced anyone to adopt his perspective. He was simply exercising what Jung called the magician function, shaping perception so precisely that reality itself seems to organize around his vision. Jung warned extensively about this kind of power. He wrote about how certain individuals, particularly those with dominant intuitive functions, could cast spells not through supernatural means, but through their sophisticated understanding of how meaning is constructed in human consciousness. They become narrative magicians, and everyone else lives inside their spell without realizing they're enchanted. The shadow side of narrative control emerged clearly when Thomas's longtime colleague Sarah, another executive who'd watched his pattern for years, finally confronted him privately. She said, "You've created a version of reality where you're always right, not because you force people to agree with you, but because you control the frame through which everything is interpreted. You determine what counts as evidence, what gets remembered, what story gets told. And you've done it so skillfully that most people don't even realize you're the author of the reality they're living in." Thomas was initially defensive. He genuinely believed he was just helping people see situations clearly, just offering strategic perspective, just clarifying what was really happening. But Sarah's observation planted a seed that grew into genuine self-examination, and what Thomas discovered horrified him. He had been unconsciously creating narrative monopolies wherever he went, not just at work, but in his personal life, his friend groups, his family dynamics. He had positioned himself as the person who could see what's really happening in every situation, and over time, people had stopped trusting their own interpretations of reality and had started deferring to his. He recognized the God complex beneath it all, the unconscious belief that his perception of reality was more accurate than others, that his framing was more true than alternative framings, that his narrative was the real story while everyone else's was distorted by unconsciousness. He had become, in Jung's terms, inflated with the archetype of the sage, the one who knows, the one who sees truth, the one who interprets reality for those still lost in illusion. But the truly disturbing realization was this: Thomas's narrative control had created a situation where he could never be wrong. If his predictions came true, it confirmed his superior insight. If his predictions didn't come true, he could reframe what had happened to make it seem like a different version of what he'd predicted. Or he could explain the outcome as resulting from people not following his wisdom closely enough. He had constructed a psychological fortress where every outcome confirmed his authority. This is the shadow of narrative control. Using your sophisticated understanding of how meaning is constructed to become the author of others' realities, the interpreter of events. the determiner of what's true and what's distorted. It's wielding enormous power while claiming you're just helping people see clearly. It's becoming the priest who mediates reality for the congregation without anyone recognizing that the religion they're practicing is your unconscious vision. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But the person who controls the narrative never allows themselves to be transformed. They remain the stable interpreter while everyone else's reality gets reorganized according to their frame. They position themselves outside the story as the narrator, never a character whose perspective might be limited, biased, or serving unconscious agendas. Think about your own patterns. How often do you find yourself being the person who explains what's really happening in situations? How often do people come to you to help them interpret events, understand dynamics, make sense of confusing situations? How often do you subtly reframe conversations so that your preferred interpretation becomes the obvious one? How often do you control which facts get emphasized, which get minimized, which story those facts get embedded within? Do you find yourself unconsciously authoring the reality that your family, your friend group, your workplace operates within? Have you become the person whose interpretation of events becomes the group's memory of events? Do you notice that people have stopped trusting their own perceptions and have started checking with you to understand what really happened? And most importantly, do you ever question your own narratives? Do you ever consider that your framing might be serving your unconscious agendas rather than objective truth? Do you ever examine whose interests are served by the stories you tell? Or have you achieved what Thomas achieved, a psychological position where you're always right because you control the criteria for rightness? The path toward integration requires something brutal. You need to admit that you don't have access to what's really happening. You have access to your interpretation, which is filtered through your biases, your wounds, your unconscious agendas, your need for power. And when you position your interpretation as the real story, you're not serving truth, you're serving your ego's need to be the one who knows. Trait 10, social gravity wells. Narrative control shapes how people interpret reality, but there's an even more fundamental form of power that the INTJ, INFJ empath often wields unconsciously. They become psychological centers around which entire social systems organize. Jung called this numinous presence, the quality of being experienced as somehow special, somehow necessary, somehow irreplaceable in people's psychological universe. And the INTJ, INFJ empath, often without conscious intention, creates what I call social gravity wells, psychological force fields that pull people into orbit around them. Let me tell you about Miranda, an INFJ who became a spiritual teacher. Miranda's journey started authentically. She had done profound healing work, studied multiple wisdom traditions, developed genuine insight. She started offering workshops and retreats, focused on shadow work and conscious relating. And people were transformed. Students experienced breakthroughs, integrated shadow material, developed more conscious relationships with themselves and others. But something else was happening beneath the surface, something Miranda herself didn't initially recognize. As her community grew, a particular dynamic emerged. Students became increasingly dependent on Miranda's presence, validation, and wisdom to access their own consciousness. They couldn't make important decisions without consulting her. They couldn't trust their own intuitions without her confirmation. They couldn't feel spiritually aligned without her guidance. Miranda had become what Jung called a mana personality, someone who carries projected numinous power for others. In Jungian terms, students were projecting the archetype of the wise elder onto Miranda, experiencing her as the source of wisdom, rather than recognizing wisdom as something they could access directly within themselves. And while this is a natural stage in psychological development, the danger comes when the teacher unconsciously colludes with the projection by accepting the inflation rather than working to dissolve it. Miranda did exactly this, though unconsciously. She had created a community structure where students' sense of self-worth, spiritual progress, and psychological well-being were all contingent on her approval and insight, not through explicit demands or overt control, but through the gravitational pull of her charisma combined with her genuine gifts. Here's how it manifested. Students would share vulnerable experiences in group sessions, and Miranda's response would determine how they felt about those experiences. If Miranda offered affirmation, "Yes, that's beautiful shadow integration," the student would feel spiritually validated. If Miranda expressed concern, "I wonder if you're spiritually bypassing the real wound underneath," the student would spiral into self-doubt. Miranda's interpretation became more real to students than their own direct experience. Students organized their lives around Miranda's teaching schedule. They made relationship decisions based on whether Miranda would approve. They measured their spiritual progress by how often Miranda referenced them as examples of successful work. They competed unconsciously for her attention, her validation, her recognition as advanced students. The entire community had become a solar system with Miranda as the sun, and no one, including Miranda, consciously recognized the dependency structure that had been created. The gravitational field was so strong that when students did try to individuate, to develop their own teaching, to trust their own wisdom, to create some autonomy from Miranda's orbit, they experienced it as terrifying separation rather than healthy development. And Miranda unconsciously reinforced this. When students became too independent, she would express concern about their readiness, worry that they were moving too fast, suggest they needed more time in the container of her teaching before going out on their own. This is the social gravity well in action, creating psychological dependency structures where others need your insight, validation, or presence to feel secure, conscious, or worthy. And the most insidious part is that it's built on genuine gifts and authentic care. Miranda really was wise. She really did have profound insight. She really did care about her students' growth. But those genuine qualities had become entangled with her unconscious need to be necessary, to be irreplaceable, to be the center of a psychological kingdom. Jung called this the inflation of the helping function. He wrote that those who identify with the archetype of the helper, the healer, or the wise one will unconsciously create situations where others remain dependent on their help, their healing, their wisdom. Because without that dependency, the helper's identity collapses. The helper needs people to need them, or they don't know who they are. Miranda's reckoning came through a long-term student named David who had been with her for 7 years. David had done extraordinary work, integrated massive shadow material, transformed his relationships, developed his own depth of consciousness. But David realized he couldn't leave Miranda's community, not because he was still learning, but because he had become psychologically dependent on her validation. His sense of spiritual worthiness was contingent on her approval. His trust in his own wisdom was contingent on her confirmation. So David did something terrifying. He left the community without Miranda's blessing. No dramatic exit, no public confrontation. He simply stopped attending, stopped seeking her guidance, stopped organizing his consciousness around her teaching. And he experienced what felt like withdrawal. He doubted himself constantly. He second-guessed every intuition. He felt spiritually lost without Miranda's gravitational field orienting him. But through that disorientation, David discovered something crucial: his own direct access to wisdom, his own capacity for consciousness, his own spiritual authority that didn't require external validation, and he realized that Miranda's teaching, while profound in many ways, had ultimately been creating dependency rather than sovereignty. She had been giving people access to consciousness through her, rather than teaching them how to access consciousness directly. David wrote Miranda a letter that shook her to her core. You created a community where you're God, not overtly, you'd never be that obvious, but functionally, we orbit around you. We need your validation. We can't trust ourselves without your confirmation, and you need that. Your identity is built on being the irreplaceable center of our spiritual lives. You're not teaching us to be sovereign, you're teaching us to need you. And I think some part of you knows this, which is why you become uncomfortable when students become too independent. You're not a cult leader in the traditional sense, but you've created a psychological cult, where we've all agreed to position you as the source of light, rather than learning to recognize the light within ourselves. Miranda's first response was devastation, followed by defensive rage. She had given everything to this community, sacrificed her private life, poured her wisdom into these teachings. How dare David accuse her of creating dependency when she'd only ever wanted people to become conscious? But David's words haunted her because deep in her psyche she knew they were true. She began the painful work of examining her own shadow, and what she discovered was the core wound beneath her teaching. As a child, she had been invisible unless she was helping others, unless she was being useful, unless she was the one people turned to in crisis. Her mother had been emotionally neglectful, except when Miranda played the role of family therapist, managing everyone's emotions and maintaining peace. Miranda had learned that her value was contingent on being necessary, and she had recreated that exact dynamic in her spiritual community. She had surrounded herself with people who needed her so that she could maintain her sense of worth. The gravity well she'd created wasn't just about teaching, it was about survival. Her entire identity, her sense of value, her protection against the childhood terror of being unnecessary and therefore unloved. All of it was wrapped up in being the center that others orbited around. She needed them to need her, or she would have to face the wound that had been driving her helping all along, the belief that she was worthless unless she was indispensable. This is the shadow of the social gravity well, using your genuine gifts to create dependency structures that serve your unconscious wound, building psychological kingdoms where you reign not through force, but through the gravitational pull of people's projected need for your wisdom, validation, or presence. It's becoming the sun that people orbit around, and unconsciously sabotaging any movement toward independence because their sovereignty threatens your identity. Jung wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, their love is lacking." The INTJ, INFJ empath who creates social gravity wells believes they're offering love, and they are, in part. But entangled with that love is power, the power to be necessary, the power to be irreplaceable, the power to be the center. And as long as that power remains unconscious, it corrupts every genuine offering of wisdom, every authentic moment of healing, every real gift of insight. Think about your own social systems. How many people in your life have become psychologically dependent on your wisdom, your insight, your emotional availability? How many people can't make decisions without consulting you? How many people organize their sense of self-worth around your validation? How many people have you unconsciously trained to need you? And more importantly, do you feel threatened when people in your orbit become too independent? Do you experience others' sovereignty as abandonment? Do you find yourself subtly undermining people who no longer need you as much as they once did? Do you create situations where you get to be the irreplaceable center, the necessary anchor, the one everyone turns to? Have you built your entire identity around being needed? And what would happen to your sense of self if the people in your life suddenly didn't need your wisdom, your guidance, your special insight anymore? Would you celebrate their independence, or would you experience it as devastating loss? The path toward integration requires something brutal. You need to actively work to dissolve the dependency structures you've created. You need to teach people how to access wisdom directly rather than through you. You need to become okay with not being necessary. You need to face the wound that makes you need to be needed and heal it rather than building your entire life around reinforcing it. For Miranda, this meant fundamentally restructuring her teaching. She began explicitly naming the projection dynamic, working actively to help students dissolve their dependency on her validation. She created spaces for peer teaching, where students learned to trust each other's wisdom rather than only trusting hers. She celebrated students who left to develop their own teaching, rather than trying to keep them in her orbit. Most painfully, she had to face the terror of not being the center, not being necessary, not being special, and discover that her value didn't depend on being irreplaceable. This is the work of integration for the reality weaver, the narrative controller, the center of social gravity wells, recognizing that your gift of insight doesn't give you the right to control how others interpret reality, and your capacity to be psychologically numinous doesn't justify creating dependency. Learning to offer your gifts while actively working to make yourself unnecessary, using your power to create sovereignty rather than dependency, becoming okay with people leaving your orbit, disagreeing with your narratives, trusting their own interpretations over yours. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But who are you when you're not the narrator of others' reality? Who are you when you're not the center that others orbit around? Who are you when people don't need you anymore?" The answers to those questions will either destroy your inflated identity or reveal your genuine self. One way leads to continued shadow possession. The other leads to liberation. Comment below if you've recognized yourself as a reality weaver or a creator of social gravity wells. Whose reality have you been unconsciously authoring? Who has become psychologically dependent on your presence or validation? What dependency structures do you need to actively dissolve? The answers will be uncomfortable, but discomfort is the price of consciousness. We're approaching the final traits now, the culmination of everything we've explored, the selective empathy that weaponizes your caring. The mirror effect that reveals this entire journey has been about facing your own shadow, and ultimately, the choice between remaining an unconscious weapon or becoming a conscious sacred warrior. The descent continues. Stay with me. We're almost at the bottom, which means we're almost at the breakthrough. We arrive now at the final trait and the revelation that transforms everything you've learned. This is where the entire journey inverts, where the mirror turns around, where you discover that this video hasn't been about understanding the INTJ, INFJ empath. It's been about confronting your own shadow. Trait number 11, selective empathy as weapon. Throughout this exploration, we've operated under the assumption that the INTJ, INFJ empath's empathy is a constant, unwavering capacity, that they feel deeply, consistently, universally. But here's the final and perhaps most disturbing truth. Their empathy isn't universal. It's not unconditional. It's selective, strategic, and often unconsciously deployed as a weapon of control. The INTJ, INFJ empath can turn their empathy on and off with precision that would be frightening if it were more visible. They extend profound care, deep understanding, and emotional attunement to those who serve their vision, validate their identity, or remain within their psychological orbit. But they can withdraw that empathy completely, not gradually, not reluctantly, but instantly and absolutely, from those they've judged unworthy, those who threaten their inflation, those who challenge their authority. Jung called this affect control, the ability to regulate emotional responses so precisely that feeling itself becomes a tool, rather than a spontaneous human experience. And in the INTJ, INFJ empath, this control reaches extraordinary levels. They can feel your pain as if it were their own, and then, if you disappoint them or violate their standards, they can feel absolutely nothing about your suffering, as if a switch has been flipped and you've ceased to exist as someone deserving empathic consideration. Let me tell you about Catherine, an INTJ physician who had built her career on her extraordinary bedside manner. Patients described her as the most caring doctor they'd ever encountered. She remembered details about their lives, anticipated their emotional needs, communicated with a gentleness that made even difficult diagnoses bearable. Her empathy seemed boundless. She would stay late to sit with anxious patients, call personally to check on recovery progress, go above and beyond in ways that seemed to transcend professional obligation. But Catherine's colleagues noticed a disturbing pattern. Her empathy had rigid boundaries that corresponded exactly to her judgment of people's worthiness. Patients who followed her recommendations, who trusted her expertise, who expressed appropriate gratitude, these patients received the full force of her compassionate care. But patients who questioned her diagnoses, who sought second opinions, who didn't comply with treatment plans in ways Catherine judged as irresponsible, these patients experienced a completely different Catherine, not overtly hostile, not unprofessional, just cold. The warmth vanished. The extra care disappeared. She became efficient, clinical, detached. She fulfilled her professional obligations perfectly, but the empathic connection was gone. And when these patients suffered complications or experienced distress, Catherine felt nothing. No concern, no compassion, no emotional resonance. They had been judged unworthy, and her empathy had been withdrawn as completely as if it had never existed. The same pattern showed up in Catherine's personal life. She could be breathtakingly compassionate with her chosen circle, her partner, her close friends, her mentees who reflected well on her. But anyone outside that circle, anyone who had disappointed her or failed to meet her standards, encountered a version of Catherine that seemed barely human in its emotional detachment. She could witness their suffering with complete neutrality, as if observing strangers she had no connection to. What made this particularly disturbing was that Catherine genuinely didn't recognize the contradiction. From her perspective, she was simply being appropriately compassionate with people who deserved care, and appropriately detached from people who had proven themselves unworthy of her emotional investment. She saw her selective empathy not as a weapon, but as healthy boundary setting, as appropriate conservation of her emotional resources, as natural consequences for others' choices. But Jung would see something else, the shadow of the judge who determines who deserves to be seen as human and who doesn't. The inflation of someone who believes their assessment of worthiness is objective truth rather than subjective judgment, filtered through unconscious biases. The weaponization of care itself, where empathy becomes a reward for compliance, and emotional abandonment becomes punishment for challenge. This is perhaps the most dangerous trait because it allows the INTJ INFJ empath to devastate others while maintaining complete moral certainty. When you can turn off your empathy for someone, you can harm them without remorse. You can door slam them without guilt. You can watch them suffer without discomfort. You can destroy relationships without ambivalence, because they've been categorized as unworthy of your emotional consideration, and your sophisticated ethical framework justifies that categorization completely. The selective nature of INTJ, INFJ empathy reveals the lie at the center of their self-concept. They're not actually the universal empaths they believe themselves to be. They're highly strategic emotional investors who extend care based on complex unconscious calculus about worthiness, loyalty, and validation of their superior consciousness. Their empathy isn't a spontaneous human response. It's a function directed by their unconscious agenda. Jung wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. The people you've withdrawn your empathy from, the ones you can watch suffer without feeling anything, they're not revealing their unworthiness. They're revealing your shadow, your capacity for emotional cruelty, your ability to dehumanize anyone who threatens your inflation, your willingness to weaponize care itself by making it conditional on behavior that serves your psychological needs. Think about your own patterns. Who receives your full empathic consideration and who doesn't? Have you noticed that your empathy flows freely toward people who validate you, follow your guidance, remain appropriately grateful for your wisdom, and that it evaporates completely for people who challenge you, disagree with you, develop independence from you, or fail to meet your standards? Do you experience this selective empathy as problematic? Or do you experience it as appropriate discrimination between those worthy of your care and those who aren't? Have you convinced yourself that your emotional withdrawal is healthy boundary setting rather than psychological violence? Have you justified your capacity to feel nothing about certain people's suffering by telling yourself they brought it on themselves through their choices? The shadow of selective empathy is using your capacity for care as a weapon of control, extending it to reward compliance and withdrawing it to punish challenge. It's playing God by determining who deserves to be seen as human and who can be reduced to non-being through your emotional abandonment. It's believing that your empathy is a precious resource that should only be given to those who earn it, rather than recognizing it as your basic human obligation to meet others with compassion, regardless of whether they serve your ego's needs. The mirror effect reversal. And now we arrive at the moment everything inverts, the moment where this entire 3-hour journey reveals its true purpose. Because if you've been watching this video and recognizing these traits, penetrating perception, prophetic pattern recognition, atmospheric control, strategic vulnerability, door slamming, moral absolutism, unconscious archaeology, leverage collection, narrative control, social gravity wells, selective empathy, then something important has been happening. You haven't been learning about the INTJ, INFJ empath. You've been confronting your own shadow. Every trait we've explored, every pattern we've exposed, every danger we've named, it's all been a mirror. And whether you identify as INTJ, INFJ, or any other type, whether you're an empath or not, whether you've recognized yourself explicitly in these descriptions or felt defensive resistance throughout, the mirror has been showing you something crucial about your own psyche. Jung's most fundamental insight was this: everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The inverse is equally true. Everything we recognize in others is actually revealing something about our own potential, our own shadow, our own dangerous capacities that we've been unconscious of. If you're watching this video and thinking, yes, I know someone exactly like this, someone who manipulates through empathy, someone who controls through insight, someone dangerous in exactly these ways, then congratulations. You've just identified your projected shadow. The person you're thinking of isn't the problem. They're the mirror reflecting back your own disowned capacity for manipulation, control, and tyranny. And if you're watching this video and recognizing yourself in these traits, feeling exposed, uncomfortable, defensive, then congratulations to you as well. You're experiencing the first stage of shadow integration, recognition. The discomfort you're feeling isn't evidence that you're a bad person. It's evidence that you're becoming conscious of capacities you've been wielding unconsciously. Here's the paradox that Jung discovered. and that this entire video has been building toward. You are dangerous precisely because you don't think you are. The INTJ and INFJ empath is uniquely dangerous not because they're more evil than other types, but because their gifts are so sophisticated that they can devastate others while genuinely believing they're being helpful, authentic, conscious. But this paradox applies to everyone. We're all dangerous when we're unconscious. We all possess capacities for manipulation, control, and harm that we refuse to acknowledge. We all wield power that we deny wielding. We all project our shadows onto others rather than integrating them ourselves. The 11 traits aren't unique to INTJ and INFJ empaths. They're archetypal shadows that manifest in anyone with developed psychological intelligence who hasn't done the work of integration. The specific flavor might differ depending on personality type, but the underlying dynamic is universal. When you possess power without consciousness, you become dangerous. When you wield influence without recognizing you're wielding it, you become tyrannical. When you see others clearly but refuse to see yourself with equal clarity, you become the very darkness you claim to be illuminating. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This entire video has been an invitation to make your darkness conscious, not to shame you, not to prove that empaths are actually narcissists or that INTJ, INFJ types are secretly evil, but to wake you up to the shadow material that's been operating beneath your conscious awareness, using your gifts for purposes that serve your ego rather than consciousness. The real danger of the INTJ, INFJ empath isn't the 11 traits themselves. Those are just capacities, neutral in themselves, capable of being used for good or ill. The real danger is the unconsciousness, the inflation that makes you believe you're immune to the corruptions of power, the God complex that positions you as fundamentally different from and superior to ordinary humans, the conviction that your empathy makes you incapable of harm, your insight makes you incapable of blindness, your consciousness makes you incapable of shadow possession. And the solution, the only solution Jung ever offered, is brutal honesty, facing your shadow, admitting your capacity for harm, recognizing that every trait that makes you capable of profound good makes you equally capable of profound evil, accepting that you're not the healer you think you are. You're a human being standing at the edge between healer and destroyer, and which direction you move depends entirely on your willingness to remain conscious of both potentials. This is the integration paradox. You must acknowledge your dangerous capacities in order to transform them from unconscious weapons into conscious gifts. You must claim the shadow in order to prevent it from possessing you. You must admit you're capable of manipulation in order to stop manipulating. You must recognize your power in order to wield it ethically. So here's the question that this entire video has been building toward. Are you willing to face your shadow? Not the sanitized version that your persona finds acceptable, but the real shadow, the part of you that has used empathy to control, insight to manipulate, wisdom to dominate, the part that has door-slammed people to avoid vulnerability, collected leverage to maintain power, created dependency to protect against being unnecessary, the part that has controlled narratives to stay right, engineered social systems to remain central, withdrawn empathy to punish those who challenged your inflation. Are you willing to admit that you've been the dangerous one? That your empathic abilities haven't made you innocent, they've made you capable of sophisticated harm? That your consciousness hasn't exempted you from shadow, it's just made your shadow more subtle and more devastating? Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." This is what that acceptance looks like. Recognizing that you contain both the healer and the destroyer, that you're capable of profound love and profound cruelty, that your gifts can serve consciousness or ego, that you're not special in a way that exempts you from the human condition. You're special in a way that makes you capable of extraordinary harm if you remain unconscious. The mirror has been turned. You're not looking at the INTJ, INFJ empath anymore. You're looking at yourself. Every trait we've explored has been showing you your own potential for danger. And now you have a choice. Remain unconscious and continue wielding these capacities as shadow weapons, or become conscious and transform them into sacred gifts. Comment below. Not with defensiveness, not with justification, but with honest recognition. Which trait did you recognize most powerfully in yourself? Which shadow pattern has been operating in your relationships? Which dangerous capacity have you been unconscious of? Don't confess for absolution. Claim your shadow for integration, because the journey isn't over. We still have the integration framework, the warnings, and ultimately, the transformation. But transformation can only happen after recognition. The mirror has shown you your face. The question is, are you brave enough to keep looking?